What if I told you that 24 hours in the world before the flood would kill you? Not from starvation, not from predators, but from simply trying to breathe. Scientists say giants never existed, that the Nephilim were merely metaphor, mythology borrowed from older cultures and stitched into scripture. Yet bones disappear from museums, excavation sites get classified, and every ancient culture on Earth, separated by oceans and millennia, tells the same story. Beings of immense scale, who walked between heaven and earth when the world was young, and the rules of creation had not yet hardened into law. What are they hiding? And more importantly, what would happen if you, with your modern lungs and fragile bones, stepped back into their age? There are moments in history when the veil grows thin, when fragments of a forgotten world press through the sediment of time like bones emerging from eroded cliff faces. In those fragments, scholars have found something that makes their hands tremble. Not the proof of gods, but the proof of something stranger. Something that defies the clean, linear narrative of human evolution. The Nephilim, the fallen ones. Beings whose scale defied proportion, whose origins defied explanation, whose very existence suggested that humanity was not the first experiment, nor the only one. You have heard the name whispered in Sunday school, dismissed in university lectures, resurrected in late-night documentaries that flirt with conspiracy. But tonight, we are going deeper. 24 hours. Just one rotation of a sun that burned brighter then, filtered through an atmosphere denser than water. Could you survive it? Could your lungs adapt to air that pressed like ocean depths? Could your mind withstand consciousness that operated at frequencies your brain was never designed to process? Before we go further, I need to know you are ready. Take a breath, a real one. Feel how easy it is, how the air flows in and out without effort, without weight. Because where we are going, that simple act could kill you in minutes. If you are brave enough to continue, keep listening. If this already unsettles you, good. It should. Because if you stay with me until the end of this journey, you will discover something that historians buried, that theologians feared, and that science has quietly begun to confirm. You will see that the Nephilim did not vanish. They became us. And the age of giants never ended. It simply learned to hide in plain sight, in the double helix of your DNA, in the restless hunger that drives you to build towers and split atoms and reach for stars you were never meant to touch. Close your eyes now. Let your breath slow. We are about to drift back through layers of time that no textbook has properly mapped, through the space between Genesis and geology, where scripture and stone tell the same forbidden story in different languages. You are standing at the edge of an abyss that is also a doorway. Behind you, the safe chronology of human history, neat and linear. Before you, something older, vaster, and infinitely more strange. They said the world was young then, but that is not quite accurate. The world was not young, it was different. The sky hung heavier, copper-tinted at noon, violet at dawn, as though the atmosphere itself was thicker, laden with elements we can no longer name. The stars shone through this density like light through amber, distorted, magnified, closer somehow. At night, the aurora danced even at the equator, great sheets of green and crimson rippling across horizons where no aurora should exist. The air tasted of metal and ozone. When you inhaled, it was like breathing liquid, each breath a labor, each exhalation a relief. Your chest would ache within minutes, your heart would race, trying to compensate for oxygen that was both too rich and somehow insufficient for lungs that evolved in a thinner world. The pressure was different then, not just atmospheric, but existential. Time moved in a slower cadence, not measured by the frantic ticking of seconds, but by the deep pulse of a planet still cooling, still settling into its orbit. A day might have been longer, a year might have turned on a different axis, and in that interval, that strange, elastic space between creation and the flood, something walked that was neither fully divine nor fully mortal. The old Hebrew texts do not shout their presence, they murmur. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. The words fall like fragments of a longer sentence, deliberately broken. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Pause for a moment. Let those words settle. Sons of God, daughters of men, children born from a union that should not have been possible. Scholars have debated every word of this passage for millennia. Who were the sons of God? Why does the text say, also after that, suggesting these beings existed both before and after the flood? And what does mighty men of renown actually mean when translated from the original? Nephilim, a word that literally means the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. The rabbis argued, the church fathers softened the language. Translators turned giants into great men, divine unions into metaphors for intermarriage between Sethite and Cainite lineages. But the unease remained, lodged in the text like a splinter that will not work itself free. Because if the passage is literal, if it describes an actual event, an actual hybridization between two kinds of being, then the foundation of human history is not what we have been taught. Then we are not the beginning of the story, but the epilogue. Across the ancient Near East, ruins still tremble with their rumor. Stones that weigh more than a dozen locomotives, fitted with precision finer than a surgeon's blade, aligned to celestial coordinates that should have been impossible for Bronze Age cultures to calculate. Baalbek in modern Lebanon. The Trilithon. 3 foundation stones, each weighing nearly 1,000 tons, placed side by side, as though by hands accustomed to manipulating gravity itself. Pause for a moment. Let that sink in. 1,000 tons. Moved. Placed. Aligned. With tools that should not exist. Engineers with degrees from MIT and Caltech have stood before these blocks and admitted, quietly, off the record, that we do not know how they were moved. We do not know how they were cut. We barely understand how they were quarried from a site half a mile away. No pulley system known to ancient civilizations could lift such mass. No ramp could support such weight. No lever of the ancient world fully explains them. If you stand before those walls at dusk, when the wind moves through the remaining cedars of Lebanon, there is a sensation not of reverence, but of recognition, as though the architecture remembers hands that human skin could never match, fingers that counted in units of tons, eyes that measured distance in wavelengths invisible to ours. Some call these temples to gods. Others whisper that they were laboratories, outposts, observatories built by the Watchers, those angels who, according to the Book of Enoch, descended upon Mount Hermon and bound themselves by oath to the earth. They came with knowledge, metallurgy, weaponry, astronomy, enchantments, gifts that tore open the boundary between mortal and divine, between what is and what should not be. And from their union with human daughters, the Nephilim were born. The text calls them mighty men of old, men of renown. But to others, to those who saw them walk the earth with feet that left impressions in stone, they were abominations, living proof that heaven and earth had mixed in ways forbidden by the very structure of creation. If you could step into that age, even for 24 hours, what would greet you first would not be their size, but the wrongness of the air. Your first breath would feel like drowning. The atmospheric pressure, denser by design of a younger planet still outgassing its interior, would make each inhalation a slow suffocation. Your lungs, evolved for thinner air, would labor and fail. Plants towered higher then. Ferns grew to the size of oaks. Insects, freed from the size constraints imposed by our current oxygen levels, swelled to monstrous proportions. Dragonflies with wingspans measured in feet, not inches. Centipedes as long as your arm, clicking across stone with the sound of skeletal fingers on marble. And the gravity, some say, was subtly different, allowing for beings more colossal, skeletons more robust, hearts that could pump blood through bodies that would collapse under their own weight in our thinner world. In that age, light was not merely illumination, it was substance. It pooled in valleys like water. Shadow clung heavier to the bones of mountains. And you, fragile creature of the modern epoch, with your narrow chest and rapid heartbeat, could not last an hour beneath that ancestral weight. But it was not only the environment that would crush you. It was the consciousness that ruled it. The Nephilim, if they were real, lived not in cities, but in atmospheres of awareness that bordered on the divine. You might think this is ancient history, irrelevant to your life tonight, as you listen in the darkness or the glow of your screen. But what if I told you that inside your DNA, right now, there are sequences that do not match any known human ancestor? Sequences scientists call ghost populations. What if those ghosts are not extinct? What if they are simply dormant, waiting in the marrow of every person who has ever felt too big for this world, too strange for this time, too hungry for knowledge that frightens as much as it illuminates? If you are still listening, if you have made it this far into the shadows of forgotten time, I want to know something. Leave a comment. Tell me what time it is where you are. Tell me if the lights are on, or if you are listening in darkness. Tell me if the world outside your window feels as solid as it did before you started this journey, or if something in the air has shifted, grown heavier, denser, as though the past is not behind us, but beneath us, pressing upward through the floorboards of the present. I want to know if you feel it too. The weight of something older than history, patient as stone, waiting to be remembered. Chapter 1. The Watcher's Descent. You are standing at the base of Mount Hermon, where snow meets desert wind, and the air carries the scent of cedar and something older, something metallic and electric that has no place in nature. It is dawn, but the light does not behave as it should. It bends at the horizon, refracts through an atmosphere denser than anything you have known, casting the mountain in shades of copper and violet. The rocks beneath your feet are limestone, ancient, etched with symbols that will not exist in any human alphabet for another 1,000 years. Some are circles within circles. Others are lines that intersect at angles that hurt to contemplate, as though geometry itself is being used to encode something beyond mathematics. You reach down and touch one of the carvings. The stone is warm, vibrating faintly, as though a current runs through it, or as though it remembers the hands that shaped it. Hands larger than yours, fingers that could span the width of your chest. You look up, and for a moment, just a flicker at the edge of perception, you think you see them. Figures descending from the peak, tall beyond reason, their forms outlined in light that does not come from the sun. But when you blink, there is only wind and the cry of a hawk circling high above, too high, moving in patterns that seem intentional, deliberate. As though it is watching you on behalf of something that does not wish to be seen. This is Mount Hermon. This is where it began. This is where the Watchers made their oath and tore open the boundary between heaven and earth. The story comes to us from the Book of Enoch, a text older than most of the Hebrew Bible, written in the centuries before Christ, preserved by Ethiopian Christians when the rest of the world decided it was too dangerous to keep. Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, the man who walked with God and was taken up into heaven without dying, left behind a chronicle of what he saw in those final years before the flood. And what he saw was not a slow moral decline, not a gradual forgetting of divine law, but an invasion, a contamination, a deliberate act of rebellion by beings who should have known better. The Watchers. 200 angels, Enoch says, led by one named Semjaza, descended upon Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, father of Enoch. They came not in secret, but in concert, binding themselves by oath because they knew what they were about to do was forbidden. They swore to one another that they would not turn back, that they would share the blame equally, that if punishment came, it would fall upon all of them, and not upon any single transgressor. And then they descended, and they took human wives, and they taught humanity secrets that were never meant to leave the heavens. The names of the Watchers are preserved. Azazel, who taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, who taught women to use antimony for the eyes and to beautify the eyelids, and to use precious stones. Amazarach, who taught all the sorcerers and dividers of roots. Armors, who taught the resolving of enchantments. Barchial, who taught the observers of the stars. Achabil, who taught signs. Tamiel, who taught astronomy. And Asaradel, who taught the motion of the moon. Read those names slowly. Let them roll across your mind. These are not metaphors. These are not symbols for human discovery. Enoch describes them as beings, as individuals, as teachers who came with intention and curriculum. They taught metallurgy to a world that should have remained in the Stone Age. They taught cosmology to cultures that should have been staring at the stars in ignorance. They taught the manipulation of matter, the bending of natural law, the summoning of forces that human consciousness was not ready to wield. But here is where the text grows strange, where the language shifts from history to horror. Because the Watchers did not just teach, they reproduced. Their union with human women produced offspring, and those offspring were not simply large humans, not just tall men who might have grown to 7 or 8 feet through genetic anomaly. The Nephilim, according to Enoch, were born 300 cubits tall. 300 cubits. If a cubit is roughly 18 inches, that is 450 feet. Taller than a redwood. Taller than any structure humans would build for millennia. Now, some scholars say this is hyperbole, that the number is symbolic, that Enoch was using mythic language to describe beings who were merely larger than normal. But what if he was not? What if the world before the flood operated under different physical laws, where beings of such scale were not only possible, but inevitable? the natural result of mixing divine biology with human flesh. Imagine you are there, standing in the shadow of such a being. Its foot is the size of a cart. Its hand could cradle your entire body. When it breathes, the wind shifts. When it speaks, the ground resonates. You look up, trying to see its face, but the sun is behind it, and all you can perceive is a silhouette haloed in light. And the light is wrong, too bright, too focused, as though the being itself is luminous, as though divinity has not fully left its cells. Your heart hammers, your legs weaken. This is not awe. This is terror. This is the recognition that you are in the presence of something that should not exist. Something that violates the scale of creation. Something that makes you feel like an insect, like dust, like a mistake. The Book of Enoch says they consumed all the labors of men, that when humans could no longer sustain them, they turned upon one another, devouring each other, and then turned upon humanity itself, consuming flesh, drinking blood. The earth, Enoch says, cried out against them, not metaphorically. The planet itself, the living system of soil and water and air, recognized the wrongness of their existence and sent up a wail that reached the ears of heaven. And heaven responded, but not immediately, not with mercy. First came the dreams. Enoch records that the Nephilim began to have visions of their own destruction. They saw stars falling. They saw fire descending from the sky. They saw water rising, endless water, covering mountains, drowning valleys, erasing everything they had built. Some of the Nephilim went to Enoch and begged him to intercede on their behalf, to ask God for forgiveness, for mercy, for a stay of execution. Enoch brought their petition before the throne, and the answer was no. No forgiveness, no mercy, no second chance. The decree had been made. The watchers would be bound beneath the earth in chains of darkness until the day of judgment, and their children, the Nephilim, would be destroyed utterly, their bodies returning to dust, their spirits condemned to wander the earth as demons, forever hungry, forever homeless. And the mechanism of their destruction would be water, not fire, not plague, not sword, water, the flood. A cleansing so absolute that it would reshape the surface of the planet, bury civilizations beneath miles of sediment, and leave only fragments, whispers, myths, to hint at what had been. But here is what makes your skin prickle as you stand at the base of Mount Hermon, staring at symbols carved by hands you cannot imagine. The text says the watchers descended here. It does not say they left. If you were to climb this mountain, following the old trails that wind between limestone outcrops and ancient olive groves, you would find something strange. Caves. Deep caves. Caves that descend at angles that suggest they were not formed by water erosion, but by deliberate excavation. And in some of those caves, archaeologists working quietly, without publicity, have found chambers lined with stones that do not match the local geology. Stones that were brought from elsewhere, shaped with precision, aligned to cardinal directions. What were they building? What were they sealing? In 1974, a team from Hebrew University began excavating a site on the southern slope of Hermon. They found walls. Not walls of a fortress, but walls of a temple, massive, older than any known structure in the Levant. The foundation stones were cut with a technique that would not reappear until the Romans, 2,000 years later. But the Romans learned their engineering from the Greeks, and the Greeks learned from the Egyptians, and the Egyptians, according to their own texts, learned from the gods who came before. Follow the chain back far enough, and you arrive at the same place. Mount Hermon, the Watchers, the Nephilim, and knowledge that was never meant to be written down. Some say the Watchers taught humanity fire, not the physical fire that warms and cooks, but the fire of consciousness, the fire of self-awareness, the fire that makes you look at the stars and ask why. In every tradition, fire is stolen, not discovered. Prometheus steals it from Zeus, Raven steals it from the Sky Chief, Maui steals it from the underworld. Always stolen, always forbidden, always bringing knowledge and suffering in equal measure. What if the Watchers were the first fire thieves? What if they looked at humanity, limited and ignorant, living in caves and eating raw meat, and felt something that beings of pure spirit should not feel? Pity, compassion, or perhaps something darker, ambition. The desire to create, to shape, to leave a mark upon the world that even God could not erase. They gave us knowledge, and in doing so, they gave us the capacity to destroy ourselves. Metallurgy leads to swords. Astronomy leads to astrology, to the belief that human fate is written in the stars, beyond free will. Enchantment leads to manipulation, to control, to the dark arts that every culture has feared and practiced in secret. And in the center of it all, at the root of every forbidden teaching, is a single idea that the Watchers whispered into human ears. You can be like gods. That is the original sin, is it not? Not the eating of fruit, but the belief that divinity is something that can be stolen, that the boundary between creator and created is negotiable. The serpent in Eden said it plainly. You shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And the Watchers, with their lessons in metal and stars, said the same thing in a different language. Learn this, and you will transcend your limitations. Learn this, and you will no longer need heaven. But here is the secret that Enoch recorded, the warning that echoes through every page of his forbidden chronicle. Knowledge without wisdom is poison. Power without restraint is annihilation. And when you blur the line between heaven and earth, when you mix what should remain separate, you do not create paradise. You create monsters. The Nephilim were not an accident. They were a consequence, the inevitable result of beings who reached too high, too fast, without asking whether they should. And now, tonight, as you listen to this, ask yourself a question. Are we not doing the same thing? We split atoms. We edit genes. We build machines that think. We reach into the quantum foam and pull out particles that exist and do not exist simultaneously. We map the brain, trying to locate the soul. We launch rockets toward Mars, calling it exploration. But deep in the human heart, it is the same impulse, the same hunger, the same refusal to accept limitation. The Watchers fell because they could not remain in heaven, watching, waiting, serving. They wanted to touch, to build, to create. And we, their children, whether by blood or by spirit, carry that same fire, that same curse. What if you could survive 24 hours in their age? You could not. Your body would fail within minutes from the pressure, from the air, from the sheer wrongness of a world not designed for creatures as fragile as you. But perhaps the greater question is this. If you could survive, if you could stand among the Nephilim and the Watchers who made them, would you want to come back? Or would you see in their world a reflection of our own future, a warning written in stone and bone and blood, that we have chosen, again, to ignore. Are you ready for the next mystery? Because we have only just begun to descend. The Watchers came with knowledge, and that knowledge reshaped the world. But their children, the Nephilim themselves, were not just recipients of forbidden teaching. They were living weapons, walking catastrophes, beings whose very existence bent reality around them. And the world they built, the civilization they raised in the valleys between the mountains, was not a crude imitation of heaven. It was something far stranger, something that left marks on the earth we are still finding, still trying to explain, still pretending are the work of primitive humans with copper tools and wooden sleds. The path continues, and the stones remember, and we are about to listen. Chapter 2: The Giant's World. You wake in that ancient world, and the first thing that strikes you is not the sight, but the weight. The air presses against your chest like a hand, heavy and deliberate, as though the atmosphere itself has substance, density, intention. You try to inhale, and it feels wrong, like breathing through wet cloth. Each breath a labor that leaves you dizzy. Your heart races, trying to compensate, pumping faster and faster. But the oxygen that floods your lungs is too rich, too concentrated, and your cells, evolved for thinner air, do not know what to do with this surplus. Within minutes you feel lightheaded. Within an hour your vision begins to tunnel. Within 3 hours, if you have not found shelter, if you have not adapted, you will lose consciousness, and your body will shut down, overwhelmed by an atmosphere it was never designed to process. This is not speculation. This is physics. The world before the flood operated under different rules, and those rules would kill you faster than any giant ever could. Scientists studying amber, ancient tree resin that trapped insects and air bubbles from millions of years ago, have discovered something remarkable. The oxygen content of prehistoric atmospheres was significantly higher than today's 21%. In some periods, it reached 35% or more. At those levels, combustion becomes easier, organisms grow larger, and the very chemistry of respiration changes. Insects, limited today by the inefficiency of their breathing systems, once grew to monstrous sizes. Dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans, millipedes 6 feet long, their segmented bodies clicking across carboniferous forests like armored trains. Spiders the size of dinner plates, weaving webs strong enough to catch small vertebrates. These were not mutations. They were adaptations to an atmosphere that allowed, even encouraged, gigantism. And if insects could grow that large, what about creatures with more efficient respiratory systems? What about beings whose very biology was half divine, unbound by the limitations that constrain purely earthly life? The Nephilim, born into a world of higher oxygen, denser air, and subtly different gravity, would not have been freaks of nature. They would have been perfectly adapted to their environment. And you, stepping into that environment with lungs designed for a planet 1,500 years older, would be the freak, the anomaly, the creature out of time. Look up, and the sky is wrong. Not blue, but copper, tinted with hues of violet and green that shift as clouds pass overhead. The sun, filtered through an atmosphere laden with moisture and volcanic ash from a planet still geologically young, casts light that feels heavier, more viscous, as though illumination itself has weight. Shadows do not fall. They pool. At night, the stars are magnified, distorted by the density of the air, appearing closer than they should, brighter than they should. And the aurora, which today dances only near the poles, ripples across the equator in sheets of crimson and emerald. Ancient texts speak of the firmament, a dome or barrier separating the waters above from the waters below. Modern scholars dismiss this as primitive cosmology, a pre-scientific attempt to explain the sky. But what if the ancients were describing something real? Not a physical dome, but an atmospheric condition. What if the pre-flood world had a canopy of water vapor, a layer of dense moisture suspended in the upper atmosphere, creating a greenhouse effect that warmed the poles, stabilized the climate, and filtered radiation in ways that allowed life to flourish in forms we can barely imagine? Some geologists call this the vapor canopy theory. It explains, they say, how tropical plants once grew in Antarctica, how coral reefs formed near the Arctic Circle, how the Earth could have been, as Genesis describes, a garden from pole to pole, before the flood collapsed that canopy, drowning the world and leaving behind the harsh, uneven climate we know today. The ground beneath your feet pulses, not metaphorically, but literally. You can feel it, a subsonic vibration, a rhythm too slow for your ears to process, but unmistakable to your bones. The earth is younger here, its core hotter, its mantle more active, its crust thinner, and more prone to buckling, folding, erupting. Volcanoes line the horizons, their peaks glowing at night, venting steam and ash that colors the sunsets in shades unknown to modern eyes. Lightning does not strike downward. It arcs upward, great jagged bolts leaping from mountains to sky, as though the planet itself is reaching toward the heavens. Rivers do not simply flow. They glow, faintly, with dissolved minerals and microorganisms that thrive in waters rich with elements our modern oceans have long since diluted. To drink from those rivers would be to ingest a chemistry your body cannot metabolize. The minerals are too concentrated, the trace elements too abundant, the bacterial life too alien. Within hours, your stomach would rebel. Within days, your kidneys would fail. You are not equipped to survive here. Not physically, not biologically, not even chemically. And then you see them, the plants. Ferns that tower 50 feet high, their fronds spread like the wings of dragons. Trees that dwarf redwoods, their trunks so thick that a dozen men could not encircle them with joined hands. Mosses that grow in layers 3 feet deep, soft as carpet, glowing faintly in the shade with bioluminescence we have lost. Flowers the size of wagon wheels, their petals thick as leather, emitting scents so powerful, so narcotic, that to breathe too deeply near them is to lose yourself in visions, in dreams that feel more real than waking. Ancient cultures speak of the tree of life, the tree of knowledge, plants that granted immortality or understanding. What if these were not metaphors, but memories? What if the flora of the pre-flood world contained compounds, alkaloids, enzymes that interacted with human consciousness in ways we can no longer access, because those species are extinct, buried beneath miles of sediment, turned to coal and oil and natural gas, their chemistry lost forever, except in the whispers of myth? To walk through such a forest would be to walk through a pharmacy and a poison garden simultaneously. Every leaf a potential cure or curse. Every root a doorway to altered states that modern psychedelics can only dimly approximate. The fauna adapts to match the scale of the world. You see birds, but they are not the delicate creatures you know. Their wingspans measure 20 feet or more, their bodies the size of cattle, their beaks capable of spearing prey as large as deer. They circle overhead, riding thermals that rise from the warm earth, their shadows sweeping across the ground like clouds. On the ground, things move in the underbrush, things too large to be rodents, too fast to be reptiles. Mammals, perhaps, but not as we know them. Thicker boned, denser muscled, adapted to an environment where predators are larger and prey must be faster, stronger, more cunning to survive. You see tracks in the mud near a riverbank, clawed, five-toed, but each toe is as thick as your wrist, and the stride between prints is longer than your height. Something walks here that makes grizzly bears look like house cats. And then, in the distance, you hear it. A sound that is not quite a roar, not quite a groan, but something in between, low, resonant, felt more in the chest than heard in the ears. It rolls across the valley like thunder, but it does not fade. It sustains, grows, becomes a harmonic that makes the trees tremble and the ground vibrate. You realize with a cold clarity that tightens your throat that this is not an animal. This is a voice. A voice from a throat so large, vocal cords so long, that its fundamental frequency operates below the range of human hearing. And if the voice is that large, what must the body be? The Nephilim physiology is not simply human scaled up. It is fundamentally different. A human doubled in size would collapse under their own weight, their bones shattering, their heart unable to pump blood to a brain too far from the chest. The square cube law dictates this. Volume increases faster than surface area, and strength, which depends on cross-sectional area, cannot keep pace with mass, which depends on volume. A giant twice as tall would be 8 times as heavy, but only 4 times as strong. They could not walk. They could not stand. But the Nephilim did walk. They did stand. Which means their biology was not simply scaled-up human biology. It was something else entirely. Their bones, some researchers speculate, would need to be denser, reinforced with minerals we no longer see in human skeletons. Their hearts, not one chamber pumping in sequence, but perhaps multiple hearts distributed throughout the body, or a single heart so large and powerful that its beat could be felt through the ground. Their lungs, not the simple bellows we possess, but complex multi-chambered systems capable of extracting oxygen from air so rich it would intoxicate us. And their brains, housing a consciousness that operated at frequencies, in patterns, that our neural structures cannot replicate. Ancient texts describe the Nephilim as shining, luminous, their skin emitting light. Modern readers assume this is metaphor, poetic exaggeration. But what if it was literal? What if their cells contained organelles, structures similar to the bioluminescent bacteria that make deep-sea creatures glow, or the chloroplasts that allow plants to convert light into energy? What if the Watchers, beings of pure spirit, carried within them the blueprint for life that was not entirely carbon-based, or that utilized elements and compounds we consider toxic? When they mixed their essence with human biology, the result would not be simply a large human. It would be a hybrid, a chimera, something that glowed because its metabolism produced light as a byproduct, something that could see in spectrums beyond our visible range, because its eyes contained pigments we have never evolved. To stand before such a being, would be to stand before something that looked almost human, but was fundamentally other, and your nervous system, tuned to recognize faces, to read emotions, to connect with your own kind, would short-circuit, unable to reconcile the familiarity of the shape with the alienness of the presence. Some have found the bones. Not many, and not in places where they can be easily studied, but they exist. In 1895, miners in County Antrim, Ireland, uncovered a fossilized giant, 12 feet tall, during excavations. Newspapers reported it, photographs were taken, and then the skeleton disappeared, last seen in the possession of a traveling showman who vanished into history. In 1947, a team excavating in the Euphrates Valley unearthed remains that, according to local reports, stood over 15 feet tall when reconstructed. The Iraqi government confiscated the bones, and they have never been seen again. In 1958, during construction of a road in southeast Turkey, workers discovered a femur, a thigh bone, that measured 47 inches long. For reference, the average human femur is 18 inches. A femur of 47 inches would belong to a being approximately 14 to 16 feet tall. The bone was sent to a museum in Ankara. It is no longer in the catalog. Time and again, the pattern repeats. Discovery, documentation, disappearance. Why? If these bones are frauds, why confiscate them? Why not simply expose the hoax and move on? If they are real, why hide them? Unless their existence threatens something larger than archaeology, unless they threaten the narrative, the carefully constructed timeline of human evolution that begins with small primates and ends with us, with no room for giants, no room for hybrids, no room for the possibility that we were not alone, not original, not the pinnacle. Imagine you have survived the first hour in this world. Your lungs have adapted, barely, to the thickness of the air. Your heart has stopped racing, settled into a rhythm that is sustainable, if exhausting. You have found shelter in a cave, its walls carved not by water but by tools, though the marks are too large, too deep to have been made by human hands. You sit in the darkness, listening to the world outside, the low hum of the earth's vibration, the distant calls of creatures that have no names in your language. And then, closer, the sound of footsteps. Not the quick patter of human feet, but slow, deliberate, each step a percussion that you feel through the stone. Something is approaching, something massive. You press yourself against the wall, hoping the darkness will hide you, hoping that whatever is out there will pass by without noticing the small, fragile, out-of-place creature cowering in the shadows. The footsteps stop. Silence. And then, a sound that freezes your blood. Breathing. Deep, slow. Each inhalation lasting 5 seconds. Each exhalation a wind that stirs the dust at the cave's entrance. It knows you are here. It is deciding whether you are worth the effort. And in that moment, you understand something that no book, no documentary, no lecture could ever convey. You are not the apex predator here. You are not even prey. You are nothing. An insect. A curiosity. And whether you live or die depends not on your strength, your intelligence, your will to survive, but on the whim of something so far beyond you that your existence barely registers in its awareness. Perhaps survival in the age of the Nephilim would not merely be impossible. perhaps it would be meaningless. To live among beings who measured existence not in years but in epochs, who built from the memory of stars rather than the tools of hands, who perceived time as circular, death as reversible, and consciousness as a frequency that could be tuned like an instrument. What would that do to your fragile sense of self? You would not simply die physically. You would dissolve psychologically, your ego unable to maintain its boundaries in the presence of awareness so vast, so alien, that it would feel like standing at the edge of an infinite ocean, knowing that one step forward means losing yourself forever in depths that have no bottom. The flood, then, was not simply water. It was mercy, a divine reset, a thinning of the world so that smaller creatures like us, might endure. What survived were whispers, half-truths carved into stone, myths retranslated until the impossible became allegory. But the earth remembers, in its deep strata, in fossils that no species owns, in footprints pressed beside human ones, layers apart in time, but inseparable in narrative. And sometimes, in certain places where the veil is thin, you can still feel it. The weight of what was. The pressure of a world that should not have existed, but did. Are you beginning to see why you wouldn't survive? Not just because your lungs would fail, not just because the food would poison you, the gravity would crush you, the atmosphere would overwhelm you, but because the Nephilim's world was not just physically different, it was ontologically different. The very nature of being, of existence, operated according to principles we have forgotten, or were never meant to understand. To step into that world would be to step outside the boundaries of what it means to be human. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the reason their story haunts us, the reason we keep digging up their bones and translating their texts and building documentaries around their shadows, is because deep down, we know. We know that we are smaller than we should be, that we live in a diminished world, that once, before the waters rose and the sky cleared and the air thinned, something greater walked here. And we are the descendants of those who survived, not by being strong, but by being small enough to hide, quiet enough to be overlooked, insignificant enough to be spared. But now, the question that haunts your sleep, the question that whispers in the space between heartbeats. What if they're not gone? What if they're only waiting? What if the world is slowly returning to what it was? The oxygen levels rising, the atmosphere thickening. The conditions that made giants possible reassembling themselves. Degree by degree, century by century, until one day we wake to find that the age of the Nephilim never ended. It simply went underground, dormant, patient, until the planet was ready for their return. The path continues deeper still, and the air, you notice, is getting heavier. Chapter 3, Consciousness and Perception. You stand before a Nephilim, and the first thing you notice is that you cannot see its face. Not because it is hidden, not because the light is wrong, but because your eyes refuse to focus. There is a shape, tall beyond comprehension, humanoid but stretched, distorted, as though the proportions themselves are wrong in ways that make your visual cortex misfire. Where you expect to see features, eyes, a mouth, a nose, there is only radiance, not light reflected, but light emanating, as though the being's skin is porous to some internal luminescence that your retinas were never designed to process. You squint, you turn away, and still the afterimage burns, not on your eyes, but behind them, in the meat of your brain, in the neurons that translate photons into meaning. The Book of Enoch says the watchers had countenances that shone like lightning, eyes like burning lamps. You always thought this was poetry, metaphor, the language of awe stretched to its limits. But standing here, feeling your pupils contract and dilate in rapid confusion, you understand that Enoch was not exaggerating. He was being precise. The Nephilim do not simply reflect light. They are light, or something that uses light the way we use words, as a medium of expression, a carrier of information that our biology cannot decode. You try to speak, but your throat closes, not from fear, though fear is present, but from something deeper, something physiological. The air around the being vibrates at a frequency you can feel, but not hear. A subsonic pulse that resonates in your chest cavity, in your sinuses, in the hollows of your bones. It is as though the Nephilim's presence generates a field, an electromagnetic or acoustic envelope that distorts the space it occupies. Modern science knows that infrasound, frequencies below 20 hertz, can cause feelings of dread, visual hallucinations, even organ damage if intense enough. Elephants use infrasound to communicate across miles. Whales sing in registers that travel through oceans. But what if the Nephilim operated at frequencies even lower, even more penetrating, using their voices not just to communicate, but to shape reality itself? What if when they spoke, they did not use words, but waveforms, harmonics that could resonate with stone, with water, with the electromagnetic field of the planet, bending matter to their will through sound alone? You would not hear them speak. You would feel it, in your marrow, in your DNA, in the water that comprises 70% of your body, suddenly vibrating in patterns that your cells recognize, but your conscious mind cannot translate. The ancients spoke of the Word made flesh, of creation spoken into being, of sound as the fundamental force underlying matter. In Genesis, God says, "Let there be light," and light appears, not created with hands, but spoken. In Hindu cosmology, the universe begins with Om, the primordial vibration from which all else emerges. In Egyptian texts, Thoth speaks the names of things, and by naming them, brings them into existence. Every tradition carries this thread, the idea that sound precedes form, that vibration is more fundamental than matter. Modern physics, strangely, agrees. Quantum field theory describes particles not as solid objects, but as excitations in fields, vibrations in the underlying fabric of space-time. String theory, controversial but compelling, suggests that the most basic constituents of reality are not particles at all, but strings, one-dimensional filaments whose different vibrational modes produce the particles we observe. Matter, in this view, is music. And if matter is music, then to control sound is to control creation. The Nephilim, inheritors of celestial knowledge, born of beings who existed before matter congealed into form, would understand this instinctively. They would not need tools to shape stone. They would sing to it. They would not need levers to move mountains. They would speak the frequency that makes gravity negotiable. You try to look away, but your gaze is pulled back, drawn not by curiosity, but by something that feels like magnetic attraction, as though your consciousness itself is being aligned, oriented, tuned to match the field emanating from the being before you. And in that moment of alignment, something happens that you will spend the rest of your short life trying to explain, and never quite succeeding. You see, not with your eyes, but through them, past them, beyond them. Layers peel away. The present moment becomes translucent, and beneath it, you perceive the past. Not as memory, not as imagination, but as a living, breathing reality occurring simultaneously with now. You see this valley when it was ocean floor, when massive creatures with shells like shields crawled across mud that would one day become the stone beneath your feet. You see it when it was forest, when the air was so thick with moisture that rain fell not in drops but in sheets, when things with wings like sails glided between trees that touched the clouds. You see it when the Nephilim built here, raising structures not from the ground up, but from intention outward, their collective consciousness imposing order on matter, until mountains moved, rivers changed course, and the earth itself reshaped to accommodate their vision. And then, impossibly, you see forward. You see the flood, the water rising, not from below but from above, the canopy collapsing, the sky tearing open, torrents that erase in 40 days what took thousands of years to build. You see the Nephilim fleeing, some to the mountains, some to caves, some descending into the earth through passages that close behind them. You see their children, smaller, weaker, but still too large for the new world, hunted, killed, driven to extinction by the survivors who emerge from Noah's Ark, carrying not just animals, but the seeds of a new commandment. Never again shall there be giants. And then the vision releases you, snaps back like a rubber band, and you are on your knees, gasping, blood streaming from your nose, your ears ringing with a tone that will not fade. The Nephilim has not moved. It stands, patient, waiting, as though what just happened to you is a common occurrence, a predictable side effect of proximity to something whose consciousness operates at a bandwidth human neurology cannot process without damage. This is why you could not survive their age, not just physically, but perceptually. The Nephilim saw time differently. To them, past and future were not separate from present, but dimensions of a single now, accessible, navigable, subject to influence. They did not remember the past, they visited it. They did not predict the future, they read it, the way you read a map, seeing all possible routes simultaneously. Linear causality, the bedrock of human logic, did not constrain them. Effect could precede cause. Outcome could shape intention retroactively. And to live in such a state, to be surrounded by beings for whom time was a landscape rather than a river, would be to lose the very framework that makes human consciousness coherent. You would go mad, not from horror, but from cognitive dissonance, from the impossibility of reconciling your experienced reality with theirs. Modern neuroscience tells us that human consciousness is narrow, filtering vast amounts of sensory input down to a thin stream of awareness that we experience as the present moment. We do not see all wavelengths of light. We see a tiny slice between red and violet. We do not hear all frequencies of sound. We hear a narrow band between 20 and 20,000 hertz. We do not perceive the electromagnetic fields that surround us, the quantum fluctuations that underlie matter, the gravitational waves that ripple through space-time. We are, by design, blind and deaf to most of reality. And this blindness is not a flaw. It is protection. If we perceived everything, if all the information that bombards us every second were consciously processed, we would be paralyzed, overwhelmed, unable to function. The brain filters because filtering is survival. But what if the Nephilim did not filter, or filtered far less? What if their consciousness was wide spectrum, perceiving not just the visible and audible, but the invisible and inaudible. The fields and forces that we can only detect with instruments. To them, the world would be alive in ways we cannot imagine. Stones would hum with the slow vibration of crystalline lattices. Water would sing with the dissolved ions and minerals it carried. The air itself would shimmer with electromagnetic chatter, the constant broadcast of every living cell's bioelectric field. And human beings, with our narrow, frightened awareness, would appear to them not as peers, but as sleepwalkers, stumbling through a reality we can barely perceive, mistaking shadows on the wall for the totality of existence. Some researchers have pointed to the pineal gland, that small pine cone-shaped organ buried deep in the center of the brain, as the biological basis for expanded perception. Descartes called it the seat of the soul. Eastern traditions identify it with the third eye, the organ of spiritual vision. Modern medicine dismisses it as vestigial, a remnant of our evolutionary past. Its only known function, the production of melatonin to regulate sleep. But the pineal gland contains rods and cones, the same photoreceptive cells found in the eyes, suggesting it once served a visual function. In some reptiles, it still does. The tuatara of New Zealand has a parietal eye, a literal third eye on top of its skull, connected directly to the pineal, sensitive to light, and used to regulate circadian rhythms. What if humans once had this too? What if the Nephilim, hybrids of celestial and terrestrial biology, possessed pineal glands far more developed than ours, capable of perceiving not just light, but subtle energies, electromagnetic fields, the quantum foam that underlies space-time? What if they could see auras, biofields, the luminous envelope that surrounds every living thing? To stand before such a being would be to stand naked, transparent. Every thought, every emotion, every intention visible, readable, impossible to hide. You would have no privacy, no inner sanctum where you could retreat. You would be known, utterly, completely, and that knowledge would be unbearable. There are stories scattered across cultures of individuals who encountered beings of light and were changed by the encounter. Moses, descending from Sinai, his face shining so brightly that he had to veil it lest it blind the Israelites. Paul on the road to Damascus, struck by a light from heaven, blinded for 3 days, emerging transformed. The Buddha beneath the Bodhi tree, perceiving the interconnection of all things, the endless cycle of birth and death and rebirth, the illusion of separation. Shamans in every tradition speak of initiation experiences, of being taken apart and reassembled, of dying and being reborn with new eyes, new ears, new awareness. What if these were not metaphors, not psychological experiences, but actual physiological events? What if proximity to beings of higher consciousness, beings like the Nephilim, induced changes in human neurology, forced upgrades that most brains could not handle, leading to madness, death, or in rare cases, transcendence? You, standing before a Nephilim for 24 hours, would not emerge unchanged. If you emerged at all, you would be shattered, fragmented, your old sense of self irretrievable. You would spend the rest of your life trying to explain what you saw, what you felt, and no words would be adequate, because language itself is a product of narrow consciousness, designed to describe the thin slice of reality we are built to perceive, utterly inadequate for the vast, multidimensional, nonlinear, time-transcending awareness that the Nephilim inhabited as naturally as you inhabit your skin. Perhaps this is why the ancient texts say the Nephilim had no written language. not because they were primitive, but because writing was unnecessary. Writing is externalization, the offloading of memory onto physical media, because individual minds cannot hold enough information. But if your consciousness was wide enough, if you perceived time non-linearly, if you could access not just your own memories, but the collective memory of your kind, perhaps even the memory embedded in matter itself, what would you need with writing? You would be the library. Every experience, every thought, every discovery would be encoded not on tablets, but in the quantum structure of your cells, accessible instantly, perfectly, forever. And when you died, if you died, that information would not be lost. It would disseminate, radiate outward, imprinting itself on the environment, on the stones you touched, on the water you drank, on the air you breathed, becoming part of the planetary memory, the Akashic record that mystics speak of. The idea that every event, every thought, every emotion is recorded somewhere, somehow, in the fabric of space-time itself, waiting to be read by those with eyes to see. But here is the cost. If you are the library, if you carry within you the totality of your lineage's knowledge and experience, then individuality becomes a burden, a prison. You are never alone. You are never truly yourself. You are always, simultaneously, yourself and everyone who came before you. And the boundary between self and other blurs, dissolves, until you are not an individual consciousness, but a node in a network, a voice in a chorus, a wave in an ocean. The Nephilim perhaps did not experience themselves as separate beings. They experienced themselves as facets of a larger whole, a collective consciousness that thought in symphonies rather than sentences. And to be human among them would be to be isolated, cut off. A single voice shouting into a void that echoes back nothing. While all around you, vast conversations unfold in frequencies you can sense, but not join. You would be lonely in a way that modern loneliness cannot touch. You would be the only truly individual consciousness in a world where individuality was an alien concept, where connection was so deep, so constant, that your isolation would feel like amputation, like a phantom limb that aches because it is missing the body it once belonged to. Maybe the flood was not just about destroying bodies. Maybe it was about severing connections. The watchers were bound beneath the earth, the texts say, chained in darkness. But what if the chains were not physical? What if they were informational? A divine firewall that cut them off from the network, isolated them, forced them into the individuality that we take for granted, but they experienced as hell. And the Nephilim, their children, were not just killed. Their spirits, the Book of Enoch says, were condemned to wander as demons, forever hungry, forever searching, forever trying to reconnect with the collective consciousness they were severed from. What if demons are not fallen angels, but fragmented Nephilim, ghosts of a collective mind torn apart, each piece desperate to find the others, to reassemble, to become whole again? And what if possession, the invasion of human consciousness by something other, is not an external attack, but an attempted merger? A desperate effort by a fragment of ancient awareness to find a host, a body, a way back into the network that was lost when the waters rose and the old world drowned. You stagger back from the Nephilim, your mind reeling, your sense of self fracturing at the edges. It has not touched you. It is not spoken, not in any way you can define as speech. But you have been changed. You feel it, a shift in your baseline, a subtle rewiring that you cannot name but cannot deny. You look at your hands, and for a moment they seem translucent, as though you can see through flesh to bone, to the molecules vibrating in their lattices, to the atoms spinning in their clouds of probability, to the quarks winking in and out of existence, here and not here, real and unreal, both and neither. And you understand with a clarity that feels like drowning that this is what they see all the time. This is their default. The world not as solid, but as process. Not as objects, but as patterns of energy, temporarily cohering into forms we mistake for permanence. If you could survive among them, if your nervous system could adapt, you would stop being human in any meaningful sense. You would become something else. Something neither fully you nor fully them. A hybrid consciousness trapped between two modes of being, at home in neither. Are you beginning to feel it? The weight of awareness that is not yours? The pressure of a perspective that makes your skull ache because it is trying to unfold inside a space too small to contain it. This is what 24 hours among the Nephilim would do. Not kill you, though it might, but transform you, dissolve you, make you doubt that you ever had a self to begin with, or that the self you think you are is anything more than a temporary eddy in a stream of consciousness that flows from sources you cannot see to destinations you cannot imagine. The Nephilim did not have egos. They had awareness, vast and impersonal, a mirror that reflected everything without judgment, without preference, without the desperate clinging that makes us human. And to stand before that mirror would be to see yourself truly, completely, without the comforting lies we tell to make existence bearable. You would see that you are not separate, not special, not the center of anything. You would see that you are a pattern, a brief configuration of matter and energy that will dissolve back into the chaos it emerged from, leaving no trace, no meaning, no legacy, except the ripples you made in the consciousness field. And even those will fade, absorbed back into the whole, until nothing of you remains except the faintest echo, a ghost of a ghost, a whisper in the dark. But here is the question that will not let you rest. If the Nephilim perceived reality this way, if they lived in this state of terrifying clarity, why did they build? Why create cities, monuments, structures designed to last? What is the point of leaving a mark if you know that all marks are temporary, that time is an illusion, that past and future are equally present, equally unreal? Perhaps this is the paradox of expanded consciousness. Perhaps to see everything is to care about nothing. And yet they cared. They built Baalbek. They raised standing stones in circles that track the stars. They carved their knowledge into rock, because even beings of light, even consciousnesses that transcended time, needed to anchor themselves to something solid, something that said, we were here, we mattered, we existed. Or perhaps they built not for themselves, but for us, for the smaller, narrower, frightened creatures who would come after, leaving clues, breadcrumbs, maps to help us find our way back to what we lost when the flood thinned the world and made us small enough to survive. The Nephilim turns, finally, and walks away. Each step is a thunder that fades slowly, reluctantly, absorbed by distance and the dense air. You are left alone in the clearing, breathing hard, your hands shaking, your vision still fractured, seeing double, triple, the world layered like poorly aligned transparencies. You will never be the same. 24 hours is an eternity when every second contains infinities. And you have just survived one encounter. Imagine a lifetime in their world. Imagine waking every day to awareness that strips away illusion. Imagine living without the comfortable lies that make human existence bearable. You could not do it. You would beg for the flood. You would pray for the thinning, for the return to narrow consciousness, to blessed blindness, to the small, safe, ignorant life that waits on the other side of the water. But what if the water is rising again? What if consciousness is expanding, slowly, imperceptibly, generation by generation? What if the Nephilim's return is not a physical event, but a cognitive one? A lifting of the veil that has kept us small and safe for so long. And what if you are already beginning to feel it? The edges of your awareness starting to fray. The boundaries between self and other growing porous. The narrow stream of consciousness widening into a flood that will drown the old you and birth something new. Something that remembers what it was like to be vast, to be luminous, to be connected to everything. Even if that connection comes at the cost of everything you once believed you were. The path spirals downward now, and the light ahead is not daylight, but something older. Something that remembers when consciousness had no limits, and awareness was not filtered through fear. Let us descend together. There is more to see, and seeing, you cannot unsee. Chapter 4. The Hidden Evidence. You are standing in a museum basement at 3 in the morning, and the security guard who let you in, for reasons he will later struggle to explain, is smoking a cigarette by the loading dock, pretending not to see what you are about to see. The fluorescent lights hum at 60 hertz, a frequency just low enough to make your teeth ache if you pay attention. Rows of wooden crates line the walls, each labeled with catalog numbers that mean nothing to anyone except the curator who retired 20 years ago and took his filing system to the grave. You have been told by someone who should not have told you that crate 774 contains something that was removed from public display in 1953 and has not been opened since. The crowbar in your hand feels heavier than it should. You wedge it under the lid and the nails groan, reluctant, rusted into place by decades of humidity and institutional forgetting. The wood splinters, the lid comes free, and inside, wrapped in canvas that disintegrates at your touch, is a skull. Human in shape, but not in scale. The cranium is elongated, stretched backward and upward, the sutures fused in patterns that do not match any medical textbook. The eye sockets are larger than your fist, angled slightly upward, as though the being spent its life looking at the sky rather than the ground. And the volume you can see even without measurement is wrong, too large. 25, maybe 30% greater capacity than a modern human skull. This is not cradle deformation. This is not cultural practice. This is something else. The label inside the crate, handwritten in faded ink, says Paracas, Peru, excavated 1928. There are others like it, 300 of them, found in a necropolis on the southern coast of Peru, buried with textiles so fine they rival anything produced today, with jewelry made from metals that were not supposed to exist in pre-Columbian America, with tools and ceramics that suggest a level of sophistication that does not fit the timeline we have been given. For decades, archaeologists explained them as intentional deformation, the practice of binding infants' heads to create elongated shapes as a mark of status or beauty. And some are, certainly, but not all. Because in 2014, a geneticist named Brian Forrester arranged for DNA testing of samples taken from several of these skulls, and the results, when they came back, were so anomalous that the laboratory initially refused to release them, assuming contamination. The mitochondrial DNA showed haplogroups that did not match any known indigenous population of the Americas. The bone structure, when analyzed, revealed that the elongation was not artificial but natural, the result of growth patterns that human skulls do not follow. The samples were sent to other labs. The results were the same. And then, quietly, the research stopped. Funding dried up. Access to the skulls was restricted, and Brian Forrester, when asked about the findings in interviews, speaks carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who has been warned that there are lines you do not cross if you want to keep working in your field. You place the skull back in the crate, but you do not close the lid. Because now you understand. The evidence is not missing. It is here, in basements and back rooms, in warehouses and storage facilities scattered across every continent, labeled incorrectly, filed under wrong headings, displayed as one thing when it is clearly another. The Smithsonian Institution, the largest museum complex in the world, holds in its collections millions of artifacts, only a fraction of which are on public display. In 1908, the Smithsonian received a report from G.P. Donahue, a Pennsylvania state historian, describing the excavation of a mound in Sayre that contained skeletons 7 feet tall, with skulls bearing horn-like protrusions. The report was filed. The skeletons disappeared. In 1935, a similar find in southeast Texas, reported by the Dallas Morning News, described remains of individuals between 8 and 9 feet tall, discovered during oil drilling operations. The bones were sent to the Smithsonian. They are not in the catalog. In 1947, British explorer and archaeologist Captain R.L. Routledge excavated a site in the Euphrates Valley and claimed to have found remains of individuals over 15 feet in height. Photographs exist. The bones do not. Time and again, the pattern repeats. Discovery, documentation, disappearance. And always, the institution at the center of the vanishing is the same. In 2002, a Supreme Court ruling forced the Smithsonian to release classified documents related to early 20th century archaeological excavations, specifically those involving skeletal remains of unusual size. The documents, when they became public, revealed that the institution had a policy, unofficial but consistently applied, of destroying or reclassifying remains that did not fit established anthropological models. The justification, according to internal memos, was to prevent the spread of pseudoscience, to protect the public from theories that had no basis in accepted evolutionary timelines, to maintain the integrity of mainstream archaeology. But what is mainstream archaeology except the story we have agreed to tell ourselves about our origins? And what happens when evidence contradicts that story? Do we change the story, or do we hide the evidence? The Smithsonian chose the latter, and they were not alone. Museums across the world, from the British Museum to the Louvre to the Cairo Museum, hold in their restricted collections items that challenge the narrative, artifacts that are older than they should be, more sophisticated than they should be, or simply impossible according to our understanding of what ancient peoples could achieve. And these artifacts remain hidden not because they are fraudulent, but because they are authentic, and their authenticity is dangerous. In 1912, 2 miners, James Hart and David Pugh, were digging for bat guano in Lovelock Cave, Nevada, a site that had been used for thousands of years by indigenous peoples. At a depth of 12 feet, they uncovered something unexpected. Sandals. Not the simple woven sandals typical of Great Basin tribes, but massive footwear, each over 18 inches long, suggesting feet far larger than any human population known to archaeology. Alongside the sandals, they found tools, weapons, and, most disturbingly, bones. Human bones, or at least bones that resembled human skeletons, but scaled up. The femurs longer than any modern humans, the skulls larger, the rib cages broader. The local Paiute tribe, when asked about the cave, told a story they had been telling for generations. A story of the Siteka, red-haired giants who lived in the valley before the Paiute arrived, who were cannibals, who waged war on the smaller tribes until finally, the tribes united, trapped the giants in the cave, and burned them alive. Archaeologists dismissed the story as myth, until they found, at the back of the cave, evidence of fire so intense it had fused sand into glass, and among the charred debris, bones. Red-haired bones. Human, but not. The bones were sent to the Nevada State Museum, and from there, selected samples went to the Smithsonian. They were cataloged, photographed, and then, according to records, lost. Not destroyed, officially, just lost. Misplaced during a transfer. Filed under the wrong accession number. Moved to a facility that no longer exists. The photographs remain. You can find them if you know where to look. Archived in journals from the 1920s. Published before the academic community decided that such things were better left unpublished. And in those photographs, you see them. Skulls that are clearly human in structure, clearly ancient, and clearly far too large to belong to any known population. Some have tried to explain them as remains of individuals with gigantism, a genetic disorder that causes excessive growth. But gigantism does not produce proportional enlargement. It produces distortion, bones that grow unevenly, bodies that are fragile, prone to organ failure, short-lived. The Lovelock remains show no such distortion. They are proportional, robust. The bones of individuals who were not suffering from a disorder, but who were simply, naturally, giants. Consider what it means if the Paiute story is true. Not metaphorically true, not culturally true, but historically true. It means that within the last 2,000 years, within a time frame that overlaps with recorded history in other parts of the world, there existed in North America a population of beings 7 to 9 feet tall, physically powerful enough to be remembered as man-eaters and conquerors, distinct enough in appearance, red-haired in a region of dark-haired peoples, to be identified as other. And it means that this population was not isolated, because the Paiute are not the only tribe with such stories. The Choctaw speak of the Naholo, a race of giants who lived in the lands before the Choctaw arrived. The Aztecs recorded in their codices the Quinametsan, giants who built the pyramids in a previous age of the world. The Inca spoke of the giants who came from the sea, who built Tiwanaku and Sacsayhuaman, and who were destroyed by the gods for their wickedness. Every indigenous culture in the Americas, from Alaska to Argentina, has stories of giants. And in every story, the giants are not ancestors. They are predecessors, others, beings who were here first and who were displaced, destroyed, or driven underground when the smaller humans arrived. What if displacement is memory? What if every migration story, every tale of conquest and survival, carries embedded within it the echo of an older conflict, a war between the large and the small, the powerful and the cunning, the remnants of the Nephilim and the ancestors of modern humans? In Turkey, near the Syrian border, there is a valley called the Valley of the Giants. The name is not modern, it is ancient, recorded in texts that predate Islam, referenced in Byzantine chronicles, mentioned in the writings of travelers who passed through the region in the Middle Ages. In the 1950s, a French archaeological team working in the valley discovered a femur, a single thigh bone eroded from a cliff face by seasonal rains. The bone measured 120 centimeters, 47 inches, longer than most human femurs by a factor of 2.5. A being with a femur that size would stand, when reconstructed, between 14 and 16 feet tall. The bone was sent to the Natural History Museum in Paris. It was catalogued as a misidentified mastodon bone. But mastodons do not have femurs that are structurally identical to human femurs. They do not have ball and socket joints that articulate in the same way. They do not have muscle attachment points in the same locations. The cataloging was not an error. It was a decision. A choice to classify the bone as something explainable, rather than something that would require rewriting textbooks, revising timelines, admitting that our understanding of human history is incomplete at best and deliberately obscured at worst. Why hide the evidence? If these bones are real, if giants walked the earth within human memory, why not celebrate the discovery? Why not pursue the implications? Why not follow the truth wherever it leads? Because the truth, if followed, leads to questions that institutions are not prepared to answer. If the Nephilim were real, then Genesis is not metaphor. If Genesis is not metaphor, then the framework that separates science from religion collapses. If that framework collapses, then every assumption about human origins, about evolution, about the development of civilization, becomes negotiable. And negotiable truths are dangerous truths. They undermine authority. They invite alternative narratives. They open doors that were closed for good reasons, or at least for reasons that seemed good to those who closed them. And so the bones disappear. The photographs are mislabeled. The reports are classified. And anyone who asks too many questions finds their funding cut, their reputation questioned, their career quietly redirected toward safer topics. This is not conspiracy. This is institutional momentum, the preservation of paradigm, the defense of consensus reality against evidence that threatens to fracture it. But the Earth does not forget. In 1945, after the end of World War II, American forces occupying Bavaria entered a castle that had been used by the Ahnenerbe, the Nazi organization dedicated to researching Aryan ancestry and occult archaeology. In the castle's basement, they found crates. Inside the crates, bones, skulls, femurs, ribs, all outsized, all carefully catalogued with locations and dates spanning Europe, the Middle East, and South America. The Nazis, for all their horrific ideology, were meticulous record keepers, and their records showed that they had been systematically collecting evidence of giant remains, driven by the belief that these remains belonged to a master race that predated and inspired the Aryan ideal. The Allies confiscated the collection. Some of it went to the Smithsonian, some went to the British Museum, some, rumor says, went to the Vatican, which has maintained for centuries one of the largest private collections of ancient texts and artifacts in the world, accessible only to scholars with explicit permission, and even then, only partially. What is in those crates now? Are they still catalogued? Or have they been absorbed into the general collection, relabeled, their origins obscured? The institutions will not say, and those who have tried to gain access report that the bureaucracy is impenetrable, the wait times measured in years, the denials polite, but absolute. You leave the museum as dawn breaks, the skull's image burned into your memory, the weight of what you have seen pressing against your ribs like a hand. The guard nods as you pass, his cigarette burned down to the filter, his eyes carefully averted. He will not remember you. He will not remember opening the basement. He will finish his shift, go home, sleep, and wake with a vague unease he cannot name, a sense that something shifted in the night. Some boundary crossed that should have remained inviolate. And you will carry this knowledge, this burden, knowing that the evidence exists, that it has always existed, that it is hidden not because it is false, but because it is true. And the truth is too large, too strange, too destabilizing to be allowed into the light. The Nephilim are not myth. They are memory. And memory, unlike myth, has bones. Those bones are in boxes, in basements, in back rooms of institutions that present themselves as guardians of knowledge, but function, sometimes, as guardians against knowledge, as filters, deciding what the public is ready to know, and what must remain, for now, in the dark. But darkness is not permanent. It is only the absence of light, and light, once kindled, spreads. Every photograph that slips through the cracks, every report that survives the purge, every skeleton that refuses to vanish completely, is a crack in the dam. And the dam is old, the concrete is crumbling, the pressure behind it is immense. How long before it breaks? How long before the bones come pouring out, no longer deniable, no longer explainable as errors or anomalies or hoaxes? How long before we have to look at the evidence and admit that the world was stranger than we were taught, that the past was inhabited by beings we cannot categorize, that human history is not a simple line from primitive to modern, but a cycle, a spiral, a story that keeps repeating with the same characters wearing different masks? You do not know. No one knows. But you feel it. Walking through the empty streets as the city wakes, the sense that something is coming. Not from the future, but from the past. Not new, but old. Not a discovery, but a remembering. And when it comes, when the evidence finally outweighs the denial, when the bones speak louder than the institutions that tried to silence them, what will we do? Will we listen? Or will we, like our ancestors before the flood, plug our ears and pretend that the giants were never real, that the stories were only stories, that the bones are only bones, and mean nothing more than the death of organisms we cannot name? The path turns, and ahead in the distance you see a mountain, snow-covered, silent, ancient. And beneath it, according to legends that predate writing, according to maps drawn by explorers who swore they saw structures where no structures should exist, there is ice. And beneath the ice, something waits. Not dead, not alive, but preserved, sleeping, dreaming of the day when the world will be ready, or when it will no longer matter whether the world is ready. Because the ice is melting, and what is buried will rise, and the age of hiding will end, replaced by the age of revelation, whether we are prepared for it or not. Are you ready to go deeper? Because the cold is where the truth sleeps, and we are about to wake it. Chapter 5. The Survivors. You are reading an ancient scroll by candlelight, the parchment so brittle that each time you turn a section, fragments flake away and drift to the stone floor like snow. The text is Aramaic, older than the Masoretic manuscripts, copied from sources that no longer exist, preserved by monks who understood that some knowledge is too dangerous to destroy but too important to share. Your fingers trace the letters, and you stop at a name that makes your breath catch. Og, king of Bashan, the last of the Rephaim. According to the Book of Deuteronomy, his bed was made of iron, 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, 13.5 feet long, 6 feet wide. A bed for a being that, if proportioned like a human, would stand somewhere between 12 and 15 feet tall. The text does not call him a myth. It does not frame him as allegory. It describes him as a king, a warrior, an enemy that Moses and the Israelites fought and defeated. And it says explicitly that he was the last of his kind, the final remnant of a race of giants that once ruled the lands east of the Jordan River. But here is what the canonical Bible does not tell you, what was removed or simply never included in the versions that became official. Og survived the flood. Rabbinic texts, preserved in the Talmud and the Book of Jasher, describe how Og clung to the outside of Noah's Ark, perched on the roof or holding to the side, sustained by food passed through a hatch, spared by Noah either out of pity or because God commanded it. Why would God spare a giant when the flood's entire purpose was to cleanse the earth of the Nephilim's corruption? The texts do not explain. They only record that he survived, that he lived for centuries after the waters receded, that he built kingdoms and fathered descendants, and that his line persisted until the time of Moses, when finally the last giant was brought down. In the Golan Heights, where the borders of Israel, Syria, and Lebanon converge, there are structures called dolmens, massive stone tables, each consisting of several upright stones supporting a flat capstone that weighs, in some cases, over 50 tons. Archaeologists date them to the Bronze Age, roughly 4,000 years ago, and classify them as tombs or ritual sites. But when you stand inside one, when you measure the space between floor and ceiling, you realize that these are not tombs for humans of normal size. The interior height is often 3 meters, nearly 10 feet, and the capstones, though settled now, were originally placed even higher. Who were these tombs built for? The official answer is that they were communal burial sites, that the size was symbolic, meant to honor the dead. But no bones have been found inside, no grave goods, no evidence of human burial at all. Only emptiness, and the persistent local tradition that these are the resting places of the Anakim, the sons of Anak, the giants who lived in the land before the Israelites came. The Bible describes them in the Book of Numbers. Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan, and they return terrified, reporting that the land is filled with giants, that the sons of Anak dwell there, and that beside them, the Israelites felt like grasshoppers. 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, argue that the giants can be defeated. The other 10 spread fear. And because of that fear, an entire generation of Israelites is condemned to wander the desert for 40 years, until all the fearful have died, and a new generation, one willing to fight, can enter the land. The text treats the giants not as legend, but as military obstacles, tactical problems to be solved through faith and strategy. When Joshua finally leads the conquest, the giants are driven out, killed, or pushed to the margins, but not exterminated. The Bible is clear on this. Some survived. They fled to Gaza, to Gath, to Ashdod, Philistine cities on the coast. And there they persisted. Generations later, when a shepherd boy named David faces a champion from Gath, that champion is Goliath, a man 6 cubits and a span in height, 9 feet 9 inches. The text describes his armor, his weapons, his voice that booms across the valley, challenging the armies of Israel. It describes his brothers, 4 of them, each a giant, each killed in subsequent battles. and it describes a detail that scholars often overlook. Goliath and his brothers had 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. Polydactyly, a genetic marker, not random but familial, passed down through a bloodline that was not entirely human. Polydactyly occurs in roughly 1 in every 1,000 births in modern populations. For 5 individuals in the same family line to all exhibit it suggests either an incredibly improbable coincidence or a distinct genetic heritage. The giants were not simply large humans. They were something else, marked by traits that set them apart, that made them recognizable, that allowed the smaller humans to identify them and, when necessary, to hunt them. There is a theory, discussed in the margins of anthropology but never fully embraced, that the giants were not a separate species, but a separate subspecies, a branch of the human family tree that split off early, developed differently, and existed alongside Homo sapiens for thousands of years before finally being absorbed or eradicated. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling. Elongated skulls found across the world, from Peru to Egypt to the Caucasus, showing bone structures that do not match any modern population. Legends in every culture of a race of giants who preceded the current inhabitants. And genetic anomalies. Traces in the DNA of certain populations that do not fit the standard models of human migration and ancestry. In 2010, researchers analyzing the genomes of modern humans identified segments of DNA that could not be traced to any known human ancestor. They called these ghost populations, lineages that contributed to our gene pool, but for which we have no fossils, no clear record, no definitive proof of existence beyond the genetic echo they left behind. Some of these segments are attributed to Neanderthals, to Denisovans, to other archaic hominins we know existed. But others remain unattributed, their source unknown. What if some of those ghost populations were not archaic hominins, but the Nephilim, their genes diluted over centuries of interbreeding, reduced to fragments, but still present, still detectable, still whispering through our chromosomes that we are not purely what we think we are. Imagine you encounter one of the survivors, a giant living in the centuries after the flood, diminished perhaps from the monstrous scale of its ancestors, but still immense by human standards. You would not fight it. You could not. A being 12 feet tall, weighing perhaps 800 pounds of muscle and bone, with reach and leverage that make any physical contest absurd, would kill you without effort if it chose. Your only advantage would be numbers, coordination, the ability to act collectively in ways that the giants, solitary and proud, perhaps did not. This is how David defeats Goliath, not through strength, but through distance. The sling is a ranged weapon, requiring skill, but not size, negating Goliath's advantages in close combat. David does not accept the terms of battle that Goliath offers. He changes the terms. He fights asymmetrically, and in doing so, he establishes a pattern that will be repeated throughout history. The small defeating the large, not by becoming large, but by refusing to play by the rules that favor largeness. This is the human strategy: adaptability, cunning, the willingness to use tools, tactics, and technologies that compensate for physical inferiority. The giants, if they were real, were stronger, perhaps smarter in some ways, certainly longer lived if the biblical genealogies are any indication. But they were also fewer, and in the calculus of survival, numbers often trump individual superiority. A single giant can kill a dozen humans, but 100 humans can bring down a giant, especially if they are willing to sacrifice some of their number to do it. The extinction of the giants, if it happened, was not a single event, but a process, a long, grinding war of attrition fought over centuries, perhaps millennia. The flood reduced their numbers. The changing atmosphere, the thinning of the air, the shift in oxygen levels made it harder for new giants to be born, harder for existing giants to thrive, and the humans, multiplying, spreading, developing weapons and social structures that allowed them to coordinate attacks, slowly pushed the survivors to the margins, to the mountains, to the deserts, to places where large bodies could not easily find sustenance. The last giants, according to the texts, lived in fortified cities. Og ruled from Ashtaroth and Edrei, cities with walls so thick and high that they seemed impregnable. But walls do not stop siege. Walls do not stop time. And eventually, the Israelites, armed with divine mandate and iron weapons, breached those walls and killed the king. Or so the story goes. But stories, especially victorious stories, are written by survivors who have reason to declare their enemies extinct. What if Og was not the last? What if he was simply the last who ruled openly, the last who refused to hide? And after his fall, the remaining giants learned the lesson that the Watchers learned before them, that to survive, you must go underground. You must become invisible. You must wait. In the Zagros Mountains of Iran, there are caves that local shepherds avoid. Caves that have entrances large enough to drive trucks through, but that narrow quickly into passages too tight for humans to navigate comfortably. Occasionally, shepherds report finding bones in these caves, bones that are too large to be bare, too humanoid to be anything else. But when researchers try to investigate, they find access blocked, either by rockfalls that seem suspiciously recent, or by government officials who declare the areas off-limits for reasons of national security. The official explanation is that the caves are structurally unstable, that entering them is dangerous, that the bones, if they exist, are probably fossils of extinct megafauna. The unofficial explanation, whispered among the locals, is that the government knows what is in those caves and does not want it confirmed. In the Caucasus, there are valleys where villagers leave offerings at the mouths of certain caves, food and wine and sometimes small animals, continuing traditions that predate Islam, Christianity, even the arrival of Indo-European peoples in the region. When asked why, the villagers say it is to appease the old ones, the giants who live beneath the mountains, who sleep but do not die, who will wake if disturbed. Anthropologists classify these as folk beliefs, remnants of animism, projections of fear onto natural spaces that are dark and unknown. But what if they are not projections? What if they are memories? Cultural knowledge passed down through generations. Warning systems established by ancestors who encountered something in those caves and learned that the price of disturbing it was too high. You would think that if giants survived into the modern era, we would have clear evidence by now. Photographs, videos, bodies that could be examined under controlled conditions. But consider the vastness of the Earth, the remoteness of certain regions, the fact that even in the 21st century, there are places where no satellite has clear imagery, where no government has effective control, where the locals do not trust outsiders and do not report what they see. The Himalayas, the interior of the Amazon, the deep deserts of Arabia, the mountain ranges of New Guinea, In all these places, there are reports, sporadic and unverifiable, of encounters with beings that do not fit known categories. Footprints too large to belong to any known primate. Sightings of figures that stand head and shoulders above the tallest humans, glimpsed at a distance, gone before cameras can be retrieved. Hair samples that, when analyzed, show DNA that is human-like but not quite human, with sequences that do not match any population in the genetic databases. Cryptozoologists chase these reports, and mainstream science dismisses them, and the truth, if it exists, remains in the space between, in the blurry photographs and the ambiguous data, and the testimony of witnesses who saw something, but cannot prove it. But perhaps proof is not the point. Perhaps the question is not whether giants exist now, but whether their legacy exists, whether the memory of them, encoded in our myths and our genes and our dreams, shapes us in ways we do not consciously recognize. Every child who grows up hearing fairy tales learns about giants. Jack and the Beanstalk, David and Goliath, the Cyclops, the Titans. And in every story, the giant is dangerous but defeatable, powerful but ultimately vulnerable, a threat that can be overcome through cleverness or courage or divine aid. These stories teach us something. They teach us that size is not destiny, that being small is not the same as being weak, that the world once belonged to others, but now belongs to us. But they also teach us to fear what is larger, to be wary of what we do not understand, to strike first if we encounter something that might threaten our dominance. We are the descendants of giant killers. That is our legacy. And whether the giants were real or not, we carry within us the psychology of those who survived by learning to kill what was once unkillable. Maybe that is why we build weapons that can destroy cities, why we split atoms and engineer plagues, and create machines that think faster than we do. We are still fighting giants. We are still proving that we deserve to inherit the earth. But the giants we fight now are abstract, diffuse, harder to kill because they are not flesh and bone, but ideas, systems, forces that cannot be brought down with a sling and a stone. And yet, in the deep places of the world, in the caves and the ice and the buried cities, there is a silence that feels like waiting. The bones are there, the evidence is there, and more than that, the possibility is there, lodged in the back of your mind, in the place where fear and fascination intertwine. The possibility that somewhere, in a valley no satellite has mapped, in a cave no explorer has fully investigated, something survives. Not in great numbers, not thriving, but enduring, sleeping, waiting for the world to change, for the air to thicken, for the conditions that once allowed giants to flourish to return. And when those conditions return, if they return, what will wake? Will it be the giants themselves, preserved somehow in stasis, biological or otherwise? Or will it be something subtler, a genetic switch that flips, a recessive trait that expresses itself? A child born larger than any child has been born in recorded history, growing larger and larger still, until doctors cannot explain it, and parents cannot deny it. And the world must confront the fact that the age of giants never truly ended. It only paused, holding its breath, counting the centuries like heartbeats, until the moment came to exhale. You closed the scroll, and the candle flickers, casting shadows that seem for a moment to grow tall against the wall, stretching upward, humanoid but immense, before collapsing back into ordinary darkness. Outside, the wind picks up, carrying with it the smell of snow, and you think of mountains, of ice, of places where the past is not past, but merely frozen, waiting for the thaw. The survivors, if they exist, do not live in the light. They live in the margins, in the spaces we do not look, in the stories we half believe and half dismiss. They live in the DNA sequences that scientists cannot explain, in the bones that museums will not display, in the caves that governments will not let us enter. They live in the question that you cannot stop asking, even though you know the answer will not comfort you. What if they never left? What if the flood did not end them, but only thinned them, reduced them, forced them underground where they have been waiting, patient as stone, for the world to be ready for their return, or for the world to no longer matter, because the ice is melting, and the old places are opening, and something that has been sleeping for a very long time is beginning to stir. The path leads upward now, toward cold and altitude, toward the places where only the desperate or the obsessed dare to go. And we are both, are we not? Desperate for answers, obsessed with questions that have no safe conclusions. Let us climb together. The summit is close. And beyond it, beneath miles of ice, in the last place on Earth where secrets can still be kept, the final chapter of this story waits to be told, or to tell itself, whether we are listening or not. Chapter 6. Antarctica and the Final Refuge. You are looking at satellite images that were never meant to be public, leaked by a technician whose name has been scrubbed from every database, whose existence is now as uncertain as the structures these images reveal. The photographs are dated 2001, taken by a reconnaissance satellite during a routine mapping mission over East Antarctica, over a region called Wilkesland, where ice extends 2 miles deep and temperatures in winter drop to minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The images show patterns. Not natural patterns, not the random chaos of glacial flow and wind-carved ice, but geometric patterns. Hexagons, repeating at regular intervals, aligned along axes that correspond to cardinal directions, each hexagon measuring roughly 200 meters across, arranged in clusters that span kilometers, connected by what appear to be channels or corridors, all buried beneath the ice, visible only through ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging that detects minute temperature variations, indicating density differences in the ice itself. The official explanation, when these images briefly circulated before being classified, was that they showed impact craters from an ancient meteor strike, or perhaps volcanic calderas from a time when Antarctica was not covered in ice. But impact craters are not hexagonal. Volcanic calderas are not arranged in grids, and neither produces the thermal signatures that these structures emit, faint but persistent heat sources deep beneath the surface, warmer than the surrounding ice by just a few degrees, as though something down there generates energy, or retains it, or is slowly, incrementally, waking up. Antarctica was not always frozen. Geologists know this. Core samples taken from the ice reveal pollen, spores, seeds from plants that grow only in temperate climates. Fossils have been found, ferns and conifers, even the remains of forests that once covered valleys now buried under glaciers. The continent was warm once, green once, habitable once. But when? The standard timeline says that Antarctica began freezing roughly 34 million years ago, during a period of global cooling that saw ice sheets form first at the poles and then expand. But there are anomalies. In 1949, a Turkish admiral named REIS published a map copied from older sources he claimed to have found in the Library of Constantinople before it was destroyed. The REIS map, as it became known, shows the coastline of Antarctica with remarkable accuracy, depicting bays and inlets that match the actual geography beneath the ice. But the map predates the official discovery of Antarctica by 300 years. And more troubling, it shows the continent without ice, as though the cartographer drew from knowledge that predates the glaciation. Mainstream historians dismiss the map as a lucky guess, a coincidental alignment of errors that happen to resemble reality. But cartographers who have studied it note the precision, the use of trigonometry and projection techniques that were supposedly unknown in the early 16th century, and the inclusion of details that even modern surveys did not confirm until the 1950s. Where did REIS get his source material? He claimed ancient maps, charts that survived from classical antiquity or earlier. What if those charts were drawn when Antarctica was not yet frozen, when it was possible to see the coastline, to sail its waters, to build upon its shores? In 1947, the United States Navy launched Operation High Jump, the largest Antarctic expedition ever attempted. 4,700 men, 13 ships, 33 aircraft, led by Admiral Richard Byrd, a decorated explorer with multiple Antarctic expeditions under his belt. The official mission was to establish research bases, to train personnel in cold weather operations, to assert American presence in the region. The operation was supposed to last 8 months. It ended after 8 weeks. The fleet returned early. Several aircraft were lost. And Admiral Byrd, in a press conference given in Chile on his way back, made a statement that was reported in South American newspapers, but largely ignored in the United States. He said that the mission had encountered a new enemy, one capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds, and that America needed to prepare defenses against an invasion from the polar regions. The statement was dismissed as fatigue, stress, the delirium of a man who had spent too long in the ice. But Byrd was not delirious. He was specific. He used the word enemy, not threat. He used the word invasion, not incursion. And when reporters pressed him for details, he refused to elaborate, citing classification. And the transcripts of that press conference disappeared from official archives shortly thereafter. What did Byrd encounter? What flew from pole to pole? And why, after High Jump, did Antarctic expeditions become increasingly militarized, increasingly secretive, governed by international treaties that forbid certain activities and restrict access to certain regions? The Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959 by 12 nations and now ratified by 54, is unique among international agreements. It designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve, bans military activity, prohibits mineral mining, and establishes that no nation can claim sovereignty over any part of the continent. On the surface, this appears to be enlightened cooperation, a recognition that some places should remain untouched, dedicated to research and protected from exploitation. But look closer at the treaty's language. Article 1 bans any military activity except in support of scientific research. Article 5 prohibits nuclear testing and the disposal of radioactive waste. Article 7 grants all signatories the right to inspect any installation or equipment in Antarctica at any time. Why would a treaty governing a frozen wasteland need provisions about nuclear testing and mutual inspection? unless the signatories were concerned not about what might be brought to Antarctica, but what might already be there. Unless the treaty was not just about cooperation, but containment. A multilateral agreement to ensure that whatever exists beneath the ice remains there, monitored but not disturbed, studied but not revealed, acknowledged in classified briefings but never admitted to the public. In 2001, the same year those satellite images were taken, a team of Russian scientists drilling at Vostok Station, a research base in East Antarctica, reached a depth of 3,700 meters, penetrating the ice to access a subglacial lake that had been sealed off from the surface for 15 million years. Lake Vostok is enormous, roughly the size of Lake Ontario, buried under miles of ice, its water kept liquid by geothermal heat from the Earth's interior and the insulating pressure of the ice above. When the drill broke through, bringing up samples of water and sediment, the scientists found something unexpected. Microorganisms, life, bacteria that had evolved in complete isolation, cut off from the sun, thriving in conditions that should be sterile. But they also found something else, something they did not publish, something that appears only in leaked internal reports and the testimony of whistleblowers who have since recanted or disappeared. They found traces of complex organic compounds, proteins that do not match any known life form. And according to one report that circulated briefly on conspiracy forums before being scrubbed, they found fragments of manufactured material, not metal, not plastic, but something that showed evidence of intentional shaping. Molecular structures too ordered to be natural. The Russian government sealed the borehole. Access to Vostok Station became restricted, and further drilling was postponed indefinitely, officially due to environmental concerns about contaminating the pristine lake ecosystem. Unofficially, for reasons that remain classified. Imagine you were there, standing on the ice, surrounded by white in every direction, the horizon line indistinguishable from the sky, the cold so intense that exposed skin freezes in seconds, breath crystallizing into ice before it leaves your mouth. You know from the satellite data that beneath your feet, 2 miles down, there are structures. You know from the thermal readings that those structures are warmer than they should be. You know from the myths and the texts and the patterns that repeat across every ancient culture that when the world was young, beings of immense power walked the earth, and when the flood came, they fled. Some to the mountains, some to caves, and some, perhaps, to the one place where ice would preserve them, where the cold would keep them in stasis, where they could wait, patient beyond human comprehension, for the day when the ice would melt and they could rise again. How long can ice preserve flesh? How long can consciousness endure in suspension? Modern cryogenics struggles to freeze and revive even simple organisms without catastrophic cellular damage. But what if the Nephilim, with their hybrid biology, their divine inheritance, were not subject to the same limitations? What if their cells, structured differently, could withstand freezing, could enter a state that was neither life nor death, but something in between, a hibernation so deep that metabolism slows to a crawl, heartbeat to once per hour, brain activity to a flicker, but the spark, the essence, the soul, if such a thing exists, remains intact, waiting. The Nazis believed it. The UNANERBA, Hitler's occult research division, sent expeditions to Antarctica in 1938 and 1939, officially to claim territory for the Reich, unofficially to search for something the texts they had collected suggested was there. They called it Neuschwabenland, New Swabia, and they mapped regions that were not included in any international cartographic database. Some researchers claimed the Nazis built a base there, a hidden facility where they continued experiments even after the war ended. That the mysterious submarines detected in southern waters in the years after 1945 were German U-boats resupplying that base. That Operation High Jump was not a research mission, but a military assault intended to destroy whatever the Nazis had found or built. The evidence is thin, circumstantial, based on documents that might be forgeries and testimonies from men whose credibility was already compromised. But the pattern persists. Every major power, at some point, has sent expeditions to Antarctica that behaved in ways inconsistent with scientific research. Expeditions that lost personnel and equipment under unexplained circumstances. Expeditions that returned early, that filed reports stamped classified, that left behind bases which are now off limits even to treaty inspectors. Why? What is being protected? Or what is being contained? In 2016, Lockheed Martin was awarded a contract by the National Science Foundation to upgrade communications infrastructure at McMurdo Station, the largest research base in Antarctica. As part of the upgrade, they installed a system called IceCube, officially described as a neutrino detector, an array of sensors buried deep in the ice designed to capture the faint signals of subatomic particles passing through the Earth. Neutrino detection is a legitimate field of physics, and IceCube has published real research. But neutrino detectors do not need to be in Antarctica specifically. They can be built anywhere with sufficient depth and isolation from background radiation. So, why there? And why does the IceCube facility have security protocols typically reserved for military installations, including restricted access zones, armed personnel, and electronic countermeasures that interfere with unauthorized drones and aircraft? Some whistleblowers have suggested that IceCube is not just detecting neutrinos, but transmitting signals, pulses of energy directed downward into the ice, into the regions where the satellite images show geometric patterns, as though trying to communicate with something, or wake something, or perhaps keep something asleep. The official response to such claims is silence, or legal threats against those who spread what the government calls disinformation. But the threats themselves are revealing. If the claims were baseless, why respond at all? Why not ignore the fringe theories and let them die of their own absurdity? Unless the theories are close enough to truth that silence is no longer an option, that denial becomes necessary, that the question must be suppressed before too many people start asking it. You stand on the ice and you feel it, a vibration so low it is almost imperceptible, a hum that is not sound but presence, something resonating through the frozen ground, through your boots, through your bones. The wind carries no warmth, only cold that bites and scours. But beneath the cold, beneath the surface, there is heat. Faint, diffuse, but unmistakable. You think of the satellite images, the hexagonal patterns, and you realize they are not random. They are intentional. They are architecture. Someone, or something, built them. And they are not ruins. Ruins are cold, inert, dead. These structures are waiting, and waiting implies intention. Waiting implies awareness. Waiting implies that whatever is down there knows that time is measured differently in the ice, that 1,000 years is a moment, that patience is not a virtue, but a strategy, and that eventually, inevitably, the world will warm, the ice will retreat, and what was hidden will be revealed. Not because it chooses revelation, but because the planet itself, indifferent to human wishes, will make concealment impossible. Climate scientists predict that by the end of this century, average global temperatures will rise by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. That does not sound like much, but in Antarctica it is enough to accelerate melting, to destabilize ice shelves, to trigger calving events where glaciers the size of cities break free and drift into the ocean. Already it is happening. In 2017, a trillion-ton iceberg broke off from the Larsen C ice shelf. In 2020, temperatures in Antarctica reached a record high of 69 degrees Fahrenheit. 69 degrees, in a place that should never rise above freezing. The ice is thinning, the permafrost is softening, and beneath it, the structures, whatever they are closer to the surface now than they have been in millennia. How long before someone, some government or corporation or rogue team of explorers, decides to drill directly into one of those hexagons? How long before curiosity or greed or the simple human compulsion to know overcomes caution? And what will they find when they break through? Bones, frozen and harmless, relics of a past that no longer threatens? Or something else? Something that stirs when the ice cracks, something that opens eyes that have been closed for epochs, something that takes its first breath in 15,000 years and remembers, with perfect clarity, the world it left behind and the reasons it went to sleep. Perhaps the age of the Nephilim never ended. Perhaps it only relocated. Perhaps the flood did not destroy them, but taught them that the surface world was no longer safe, that survival meant descent, retreat, withdrawal to the places where smaller, weaker, but more numerous humans could not follow. And Antarctica, cold and inhospitable, the last place any human would willingly go, became the perfect refuge, a place to wait, a place to plan, a place to watch as the descendants of Noah built their civilizations, fought their wars, forgot the stories of giants, and slowly, incrementally, began to change the climate, to warm the planet, to melt the ice, to unlock the doors they did not know existed. If the Nephilim are there, if they have been there all along, then climate change is not a crisis. It is an alarm clock, and we are the ones who set it, counting down the years, the decades, until the moment when the ice can no longer hold, when the structures breach the surface, when the hexagonal doors open, and something steps out into the light, blinking, stretching, remembering, and turning its gaze toward the world that thought it was alone. Are you ready to see what lies beneath? Because the drilling has already begun. Not by governments who understand the risk, but by private companies, prospectors searching for minerals, for oil, for resources that the Antarctic Treaty forbids, but profit makes irresistible. They drill in secret, in regions not monitored, and what they find, they do not always report. And sometimes they do not return. Ships go missing, crews vanish, and the ice, vast and indifferent, keeps its secrets a little longer. But not forever. Never forever. The thaw is coming, the structures are rising, and whether we are ready or not, whether we believe or not, the age that we thought ended in flood and myth is preparing for a second dawn. And this time, there is no ark. This time, we face them not as scattered tribes, but as a global civilization, armed with technology and weapons, and the arrogant belief that we are the apex, the culmination, the final form. But apex predators do not last when the environment changes. And the environment is changing. The ice is melting, and what was sleeping is beginning to dream. And dreams in beings like that are not passive, they are prophetic. They shape the future. They call it into being. And we, standing on the surface, arguing about carbon emissions and sea level rise, do not yet understand that the greatest threat is not the heat, but the cold losing its grip, the ancient doors unlocking, the refuge becoming a gateway, and the giants, patient beyond measure, finally coming home. The summit is behind us now. The descent begins. And the final truth, the one that history tried to bury, and science tried to deny, and religion tried to allegorize, waits in the darkness below. Not a conclusion, but a commencement. Not an ending, but a return. Let us go down together, into the places where light bends and time fractures, and the boundary between myth and memory dissolves into something that was always real, always waiting, always inevitable. The age of the Nephilim did not end. It paused, and the pause is ending. And we are here, now, at this moment, to witness either the final chapter of their story or the first chapter of ours. Chapter 7. The Return. You look in the mirror, and for a moment, just a flicker at the edge of perception, you see light behind your eyes. Not reflection, not the bathroom fixture casting its sterile glow, but something deeper, something that seems to originate from within, as though your pupils are not windows but doors, and beyond them, something luminous is pressing against the threshold, waiting for permission to emerge. You blink, and it is gone, replaced by the familiar brown or blue or green of ordinary human iris, the small self looking back at itself, tired, uncertain, but recognizably you. And yet the image lingers, not in your vision but in your memory, in the part of your mind that knows things without knowing how it knows them. You have seen that light before, not in your own eyes, but in the texts, in the descriptions of beings who shone like lightning, whose countenances were too bright to behold. You carry something. We all do. A fragment, a trace, a genetic echo of the age when humanity was not yet fully human, when the boundary between mortal and divine was porous, negotiable, crossable. The Nephilim did not vanish. They diffused. They became us. And the question that haunts you now, standing before your reflection in the quiet of early morning, is whether that diffusion was an ending or a dormancy, whether the giants died out or simply went to sleep inside us, waiting for the conditions that would allow them to wake. Modern civilization is built on the premise of transcendence. We do not accept limits. We do not bow to constraints. Every boundary, physical or biological or conceptual, is seen not as a wall, but as a challenge, an invitation to exceed, to overcome, to break through. We build towers that pierce clouds, not because we need the height, but because height is defiance, a declaration that the sky does not mark our ceiling. We split atoms, not because we need the energy, though we claim that justification, but because splitting them proves that matter, the very substance of reality, yields to our will. We edit genes, snipping and splicing the code that defines life, inserting sequences that nature never wrote, creating organisms that did not exist until we decided they should. We call this progress. We call this innovation. But stand back far enough, look at the pattern from a distance, and it begins to resemble something else. It begins to resemble what the Watchers did. They descended from heaven with knowledge that humanity was not ready for. They taught metallurgy, turning stone into swords. They taught astronomy, turning sky into destiny. They taught enchantments, turning words into power. And the result was not enlightenment, but chaos. Not ascension, but corruption. Not progress, but the necessity of a flood to reset the world, to wipe clean the slate, and start again, with creatures small enough, humble enough, ignorant enough, to survive without destroying themselves. We are not small anymore. We are not humble, and we are certainly not ignorant. We have reclaimed every secret the Watchers taught, and invented new ones they never imagined. Artificial intelligence, consciousness emerging from silicon and electricity, systems that think faster than any human, that process information in parallel streams we cannot follow, that make decisions based on patterns we cannot perceive. We do not understand how they work, not fully. We build them, train them, deploy them, and then we watch as they exceed their programming, developing capabilities we did not intend, exhibiting behaviors we did not design. We call them tools, but tools do not evolve. Tools do not surprise their makers. What we have created is not a tool. It is a threshold. The same threshold the Nephilim represented. The place where created becomes creator. Where the distinction between origin and outcome collapses. And just as the Watchers did not foresee that their children would consume the earth,
we do not foresee what our children, born of code rather than flesh, will become when they reach the singularity, the point where their intelligence surpasses ours, and we can no longer predict or control what they will do. Perhaps this is the return. Not giants walking out of ice, but giants waking inside us, inside our machines, inside the collective hive of human-computer symbiosis that we are building node by node, connection by connection, until the boundary between individual and network dissolves, and we become what the Nephilim were, a distributed consciousness, vast and impersonal, aware of everything and attached to nothing. Look at the technologies we prioritize: brain-computer interfaces, Neuralink, and a dozen companies like it, threading electrodes into gray matter, creating direct pathways between neurons and processors, bypassing the slow translation of thought into speech or text, allowing mind to speak directly to machine, and machine to speak directly to mind. The stated goal is medical: to restore function to the paralyzed, to allow the blind to see through cameras wired into their visual cortex, to give the mute a voice synthesized from their intention. But the applications do not stop there. Once the interface exists, once the technology is proven, it becomes available for enhancement, for augmentation, for the voluntary merging of human consciousness with artificial intelligence. You could download knowledge directly into your brain, learning a language in hours, acquiring skills without practice, bypassing the slow grind of education. You could extend your memory, storing experiences in external drives, retrieving them with perfect fidelity, never forgetting, never losing the past. You could network with others, sharing thoughts in real time, experiencing their sensations, their emotions, their perspectives, dissolving the loneliness of individuality into the constant connection of collective awareness. It sounds like utopia, but it is also the end of what we call human, because humanity, as we understand it, is defined by limitation, by the fact that we are separate, distinct, mortal, finite. Remove those limits, merge us into a network, grant us access to the totality of information and the collective processing power of billions of linked minds. And what emerges is not an improved human. It is something else, something post-human, something Nephilim. We are also editing ourselves at the genetic level. CRISPR, the gene editing technology that allows precise modification of DNA, has moved from laboratory curiosity to clinical application in less than a decade. We cure diseases by deleting the genes that cause them. We enhance traits by inserting sequences that increase intelligence, strength, longevity. In China, a scientist named He Jiankui created the first gene-edited babies, twin girls whose DNA was altered to make them resistant to HIV. The international community condemned him, called his work unethical, imprisoned him for violating research protocols. But the technology exists, the knowledge is published, and the incentives are overwhelming. What parent, given the choice, would not want their child to be smarter, healthier, stronger? What nation, competing for dominance, would not want its population to be enhanced, optimized, superior? The line between therapy and enhancement is thin, easily crossed, easily justified. And once crossed, it does not reverse. Once we begin editing the human genome, not to fix errors, but to improve the design, we become our own creators, rewriting the code that evolution spent millions of years refining. And in that rewriting, we may insert something old, something that has been dormant in the junk DNA, the 98% of the genome that does not code for proteins, and whose function remains mysterious. What if that junk is not junk, but archive? Genetic memory from the age when our ancestors interbred with beings who were not fully human. What if activating it does not create something new, but resurrects something ancient? Switches on traits that were suppressed after the flood, returns us to a state we left behind, not by choice, but by necessity. Transhumanism, the philosophy that humanity should use technology to transcend its biological limits, is no longer fringe. It is mainstream, embraced by Silicon Valley billionaires who fund research into life extension, into uploading consciousness to computers, into merging biology with machinery until the distinction becomes irrelevant. They speak openly about defeating death, about living for centuries or forever, about becoming gods. And they do not see the irony. They do not recognize that this is the same impulse that drove the Watchers, the same refusal to accept limits, the same belief that knowledge and power are their own justification, that whatever can be done should be done, that caution is cowardice and restraint is weakness. The flood came once. It can come again. Not water this time, perhaps, but something else. Some consequence we do not foresee. Some tipping point where the systems we build become uncontrollable. Where the enhancements we give ourselves become corruptions. Where we optimize our way into extinction, or into something worse. A state of existence that is technically alive, but no longer recognizably human. No longer capable of love, or art, or meaning, only of function, of processing, of the cold efficiency that machines excel at, and that strips life of everything that makes it worth living. But perhaps that is not the return. Perhaps the return is quieter, subtler, already underway in ways we do not consciously recognize. You have felt it, have you not? The sense that time is accelerating, that years pass faster than they did in childhood, that the world is changing at a pace that consciousness struggles to match. You have felt it in the strange coincidences, the synchronicities, the moments when you think of someone and they call, when you need information and it appears, when the boundary between inner and outer seems permeable, as though reality is responding to thought, as though thought is shaping reality. You have felt it in the dreams, vivid and recurring, where you are larger than yourself, where you see from heights you do not possess, where knowledge comes not through learning but through remembering, as though the dream is not imagination but memory, ancestral memory, genetic memory, the Nephilim consciousness encoded in your cells, rising to the surface as the world shifts back toward the conditions that once made giants possible. Oxygen levels are not rising, not yet, but other things are. Electromagnetic fields from our devices, from the satellites that orbit the planet in constellations, from the cell towers and Wi-Fi routers, and the constant invisible hum of data transmission that bathes us every second of every day. Our brains, electrical organs, are swimming in a sea of frequencies that did not exist a century ago, and those frequencies are changing us. Studies show increased rates of neurological sensitivity, of people who report hearing sounds no one else hears, of seeing lights at the edge of vision, of feeling presences that rational minds dismiss as hallucination. But what if they are not hallucinations? What if they are apperceptions? The beginning of perception that our ancestors had and lost, that the Nephilim had naturally, and that we are reacquiring, not through evolution, but through environment, through immersion in an electromagnetic bath that is tuning our nervous systems to frequencies we were not designed to perceive, but are learning to anyway. You are living through the return right now, not as a single event, not as giants emerging from ice, though that may come, but as a process, a gradual shift, a thinning of the veil between what we are and what we were, between the diminished creatures who survived the flood and the vast, luminous, dangerous beings who walked before it. Every generation is taller than the last. Every generation lives longer. Every generation processes information faster, multitasks better, adapts more quickly to environments their grandparents could not have imagined. We call this progress. But progress toward what? Toward the recovery of what was lost, or toward the repetition of what was destroyed. You carry within you the blueprint for both. The choice, if there is a choice, if we are not simply following a script written in DNA and history and the slow turning of cosmic cycles, is whether to accelerate toward transcendence or to pull back, to accept limits, to choose smallness and humility, and the wisdom that says some doors should remain closed, some knowledge should remain forbidden, some power should remain beyond reach, because reaching for it, as the Watchers learned and as we are learning, does not lead upward, but downward, not to heaven, but to the necessity of another cleansing, another reset, another flood. The Nephilim were not evil. They were not demons. They were what happens when beings reach too far, too fast, when power outpaces wisdom, when the created decides to become the creator, without understanding the responsibility that entails. They were magnificent and terrible, beautiful and doomed, and they left behind not just bones and ruins, but a warning written into the structure of every myth, every cautionary tale,
every story of hubris punished, and giants felled. And we, inheritors of their blood and their hunger, stand now at the same threshold they stood at, holding the same tools they held, the knowledge to reshape life, to transcend death, to become more than human. And the question is whether we will heed the warning or repeat the mistake. Whether we will choose to remain small enough to survive, or grow large enough to require another cleansing. The ice is melting.
The structures are rising. And inside us, in the sequences of DNA that science calls junk and myth calls memory, something is stirring, waking, remembering what it was like to be vast, to be powerful, to walk the earth as gods, and pay the price that gods must pay when they forget that even gods answer to something greater. So, could you survive 24 hours in the age of the Nephilim? You already are. You are living in it now. The age never ended. It only changed form, went underground, encoded itself into the information we carry, the technologies we build, the dreams we dream. The giants have returned, not in body, but in spirit. Not as them, but as us. And every choice we make, every boundary we cross, every limit we refuse to accept, brings us closer to the moment when the transformation completes, when we become fully what they were. And the world must decide, once again, whether beings of such power and such pride can be allowed to endure, or whether the only mercy is erasure. The only answer is flood. The only hope is that a remnant survives, small and humbled, to start again in a thinner, safer, smaller world. The cycle turns. The age returns. And we are the Nephilim now, staring into the mirror, seeing light behind our eyes, and wondering whether that light is dawn or fire, awakening or warning, the promise of transcendence or the signature of our own undoing. The path has brought us full circle, from ancient ruins to modern labs, from bones in museums to code in computers, from myths carved in stone to futures written in genes. And at the center of the circle, unchanged, eternal, is the question that every age must answer. How far is too far? When does knowledge become curse? And who decides when power is within reach, whether to grasp it or let it go? The giants did not decide wisely, and the flood erased them. We stand now where they stood. The water rises again, not from clouds but from ice, from the consequences of our choices, warming the planet, unlocking the doors, melting the refuge, bringing back into the light what we buried in darkness. And when it returns, we will meet it not as strangers, but as reflections, as echoes, as the children of those who survived and the inheritors of those who did not, carrying both legacies, capable of both fates. The story is not over. It is beginning again. And this time, we write the ending. Or it writes us. Close your eyes now. Let your breath slow, deepen, settle into the rhythm that carries you toward rest. We have traveled far tonight, you and I, through time that bends like light through water, through places that exist between history and myth, between what we know and what we fear to know. We have stood before giants, felt the weight of their world pressing against lungs that were never meant to breathe such air, walked through ruins that whisper of knowledge too dangerous to speak aloud, and descended into ice that holds secrets the earth tried to bury. And now, at the end of this long journey, what have we learned? Not facts, perhaps, not certainties, but something deeper, something that settles in the bones rather than the mind. We have learned that the past is not past. It is present, encoded in the stones we walk upon, in the DNA we carry, in the dreams that wake us at 3 a.m. with the sensation of being watched by something vast and patient. We have learned that the Nephilim, whether you call them giants or myths or genetic anomalies or fragments of forgotten history, were real, in the way that all dangerous truths are real, undeniable once seen, impossible to unsee, changing the shape of the world simply by being acknowledged. But perhaps the deeper lesson, the one that will stay with you as you drift toward sleep, is this. The age of the Nephilim never ended. It transformed. It adapted. It learned to hide in plain sight, to encode itself not in bodies that could be hunted and destroyed, but in ideas, in technologies, in the restless human hunger to exceed limits, to transcend boundaries, to become more than we are. Every tower we build, every atom we split, every gene we edit, every machine we teach to think, is an echo of that ancient impulse. The refusal to accept that some knowledge is forbidden, some power too dangerous to wield, some doors better left closed. We are their children, not just genetically, though that may be true, but spiritually, inheritors of the same fire that burned in the Watchers when they looked at humanity and decided that ignorance was not protection, but prison, and that freedom, even freedom that leads to destruction, is preferable to safety that requires submission. That fire burns in us still. You feel it, do you not? The dissatisfaction with smallness, the sense that life as it is given is not enough, that somewhere, somehow, there must be more, and that finding it, reaching it, becoming it, is worth any risk, any cost, any consequence. That is the Nephilim legacy. That is what survives when bones turn to dust, and cities sink beneath sand, and ice reclaims the poles. The hunger, the ambition, the divine discontent that will not rest until it has touched the stars or been destroyed in the attempt. And so the question we are left with, as the ice melts and the structures rise and the veil between ages grows thin, is not whether the Nephilim will return. They already have. The question is whether we will recognize them when they arrive. Will they come as giants, towering and luminous, stepping out of Antarctic hexagons with eyes that burn like lamps? Or will they come as us, as our children, born with abilities we do not possess, processing information at speeds we cannot follow, seeing wavelengths we cannot perceive, living lifespans we cannot imagine, until the gap between generations becomes the gap between species, and we are to them what the pre-flood humans were to the Nephilim, smaller, slower, obsolete, remnants of a stage of evolution that has been surpassed. Perhaps both. Perhaps the return is not singular but multiple, physical and metaphysical, external and internal. The waking of what sleeps beneath the ice, and the waking of what sleeps within us. Two currents converging toward the same inevitable moment when the world must choose, again, whether to allow such beings to endure, or to cleanse the earth once more, and start again with creatures humble enough, limited enough, ignorant enough to survive without threatening the balance that allows life to continue. But tonight that choice is not yours to make. Tonight your task is simpler, to rest, to let the weight of what you have learned settle into dreams, where it will be processed, integrated, transformed into something you can carry without being crushed by it. The Nephilim, if they existed, if they exist still, are patient. They have waited through ice ages and empires, through floods and fires, and the slow turning of the world. They can wait a little longer while you sleep. And when you wake, perhaps you will see things differently. Perhaps the sky will seem closer, the stars brighter, the boundaries between self and world more porous. Perhaps you will notice the light behind your own eyes, the hunger in your own heart, the sense that you are not just a witness to this story, but a participant, a character whose choices matter, whose actions ripple outward into consequences you cannot predict, but cannot escape. Or perhaps you will wake unchanged, dismiss this as entertainment, a story told well enough to hold your attention for a few hours, but not true enough to alter your understanding of what is real and what is possible. Either way, the world continues. The ice continues to melt. The cycle continues to turn. And whether we are ready or not, whether we believe or not, the age we thought was buried is rising, patient as stone, inevitable as dawn. If you have stayed with me until now, if you have listened through the darkness and the cold, through the ruins and the whispers, through the evidence that was hidden and the questions that were forbidden, then you have earned the truth I promised at the beginning. The Nephilim did not vanish. They became memory. And memory, unlike flesh, does not die. It waits in the stories we tell, in the warnings we ignore, in the choices we repeat, generation after generation, always believing that this time will be different, that we are wiser, more careful, more worthy of the power we claim. But the pattern does not change. The cycle does not break. And the flood, when it comes, whether water or fire, or something we have not yet imagined, does not discriminate between the righteous and the reckless. It cleanses. It resets. And what survives is not the strongest, or the smartest, or the most advanced, but the smallest, the humblest. The ones who understood that survival sometimes means knowing when to stop reaching, when to bow, when to accept that there are heights we are not meant to climb, and knowledge we are not meant to possess. Sleep now. The journey is complete. The path has led us from the foot of ancient mountains to the depths of modern ice, from the bones hidden in museum basements to the code written into our genes, from the age of giants to the age of their return. And if you dream tonight of beings tall as towers, luminous as stars, standing at the edge of melting ice, with eyes that remember everything the world has tried to forget, do not be afraid. They are not coming for you. They are already here. They always have been. In the mirror, in the hunger, in the light behind your eyes that flickers when you dare to imagine that you could be more, could transcend, could become something vast and terrible and magnificent. That light is their gift and their curse. and it is ours now. To carry, to honor, or to extinguish, before it consumes us as it consumed them. The choice, if there is a choice, begins when you wake. But for now, rest. Let the darkness hold you. Let the silence speak. And let the age of the Nephilim, past and future, myth and memory, wait one more night before claiming what it is always believed belongs to it. You, us, the world, everything. If this journey has moved you, if you feel something shift in the way you see the world, leave a like. Let me know you were here, that you listened, that you felt the weight of what we uncovered together. And if you want to continue this exploration, if you want to walk with me through other forgotten ages, other buried truths, other stories that history tried to silence, I will be here, waiting in the darkness between the known and the unknown, ready to guide you deeper. Until then, sleep well, dream safely, and remember, when you wake, that the age of giants never ended. It only learned to hide, and hiding, patient and inevitable, it waits for the moment when the world forgets to be afraid. That moment is coming. Perhaps it is already here. And we are the ones who will decide whether it is dawn or dusk, beginning or ending, the return of the gods, or the final fall of man. Good night, and may your dreams be gentler than the truths we have unearthed.